Hello to all of the real progressives out there. Thank you all for tuning in today. I unfortunately have to start this stream off on a rather solemn note. I would like to dedicate this show to my late grandmother who passed away last night. She was a major influence on me. She was an extraordinary person. She was an educator. She started one of the first special ed departments in the state of Washington. Just was very liberal and had a tremendous influence on me and taught me to have the courage of my convictions. And for that, I will ever, forever be grateful. So I got to tell you guys, this was the first morning since I have been doing this that I am sitting in this chair and quite frankly don't really feel like being here. But I think my grandma was so passionate about politics that she would want me to do this show today. So I'm going to do the best that I possibly can. And this one is for her. So I wanted to start on a positive note, actually, in terms of stories. Buffalo has elected a socialist. India Walton won a major upset. So I'm going to show you guys a video here of her being asked about her campaign sort of embracing the word socialism. We'll watch a short clip, come back and discuss.
Yourself a socialist?
Oh, absolutely. The entire intent of this campaign is to draw down power and resources to the ground level and to the hands of the people. And when we think about socialism, we're perfectly fine with socialism for the rich. We will bail out Wall Street and banks and give $1 billion in tax incentives to one of the richest people in the world to build an empty Tesla factory in South Buffalo. And when it comes to providing the resources that working families need to thrive, socialism becomes scary at that point. So I'm very proud to be a democratic socialist. I am proud to have the support of Buffalo DSA and National DSA. I received a call from Congresswoman AOC this evening, and I'm just excited to be a part of this movement that is ushering progressive politics into Buffalo. Being the third poorest mid-sized city in this country, we should be considering how we begin to eradicate concentrated poverty and disadvantage, and democratic socialist leanings are a big step in getting us there.
So I think it's really tremendous that India is willing to sort of own the word socialism and defend it. I think many of us were somewhat frustrated with Bernie's response when he was confronted with the whole, you call yourself a democratic socialism or a democratic socialist, and he would sort of seem to run from that a little bit. And sort of qualify it by saying, no, it's democratic socialist. I'm not a socialist. And I think that there is a lot of value in just sort of owning it and saying, here's our belief. Here's what we think we need. Whatever you want to call that, you call it that. But here's our policy position, right? Embed the phrase sort of in what it actually means for the community. She upset. I'm blanking on the guy's name right now. I would know it if I heard it, but he was a big Andrew Cuomo favorite, and he was the incumbent mayor. So she had quite a hill to climb here to get this victory in what she kind of noted is an important city. It's a rather poor city, 250,000 people. So this is huge. And New York actually had a couple of other pretty big progressive victories. No one else that calls themselves socialist, but pretty left-wing candidates that won various seats in New York. So hopefully this is a sign that things are moving in the right direction. And I am just thrilled to see a politician actually own the word socialism. Yes, this campaign was actually about bringing power to the people. That is fantastic to see. Love to see that stuff. Next, I wanted to briefly discuss the infrastructure bill, the bipartisan agreement that was come to. I've been pretty clear that I find the attempt to negotiate with Republicans on this to be egregious, because when you have a majority, you don't have to do that. You're choosing to water down your own bill to fetishize bipartisanship, to sort of, hide behind this mask of political theater. And the truth is, and we all know this, that there are many Democrats who also do not really feel strongly about a bold infrastructure proposal. Most notably, Joe Manchin gets a lot of the talk on this, Kristen Sinema, John Tester. There are a handful of other very conservative Democrats who make life a little bit difficult on the more liberal wing of the party when the majority is so slim. So that allows Republicans to come in and water down a bill. And, this is, you guys, I don't know that we can quite emphasize enough how important infrastructure is right now in a myriad of different ways. The civil engineers have said that we need like 10 trillion pretty immediately. And this bill is going to amount to what? One over 8 years or 10 years or something. I mean, it is so inadequate that it's actually hard to overstate how inadequate it is. And that's just to get our infrastructure back to par. That's not even if we want like pristine infrastructure, or if we want to also address the climate crisis while we do this infrastructure bill, or if we wanted to fit other progressive priorities into this bill. None of that's included in the 1/10 of what we need to get back to par. So I've been incredibly frustrated by the mainstream media's tendency to portray this as some sort of massive progressive victory. It is not. It's just not. It's a grossly inadequate, watered down bill, watered down from inadequate to start with. So it's another instance here. It's like the $1.9 trillion COVID bill, the relief bill, where Joe Biden gets to sort of, without actually doing anything to deserve this credit, he gets portrayed as some sort of bold, big thinking progressive, the next FDR, right? And when you compare what he did in that instance to the rest of the world, you see how weak it is, how pathetic it is. But in the United States, our political history is so weak and pathetic that might appear bold in the context of, our politics in this country. So I think Joe Biden on a number of these issues is getting portrayed by, the New York Times and the Washington Post and yada, yada, as some sort of, bold, forward-thinking progressive. He's none of those things. He's not. He's a conservative. He's corrupt. He's the exact opposite of bold. Everything that Joe Biden does is about theater and about like coming off reasonable. I'm compromised Joe and see how I can work with everybody and all this fucking bullshit. He wants the 80s and 90s type of political credit, as opposed to actually getting something done for desperate communities and marginalized communities, right? We're going to talk later today about how Joe Biden, after giving plenty of words to George Floyd and his family, right, now is saying he wants to increase, and actually has effectively in many ways increased funding to police departments. The federal government subsidizes certain police training programs. He has doubled the amount spent on those programs, and now he wants to further increase funding to police. So he'll give lip service to the Black community while he fucks them over, while he says no to their one of the top policy demands of the Black community over the last year or so, as we see all these protests over police brutality and violence. So Joe Biden again gets to get away on this infrastructure package, seeming significantly more progressive than he actually is, and that is really just too bad. It puts the left in a tricky spot, because then when we go to campaign against the Joe Bidens of the world, or people that Joe Biden endorses, the mainstream media has made them appear progressive to a point that to a certain portion of voters, we come off like totally ridiculous. Like, to a certain portion of voters, they look at a lefty, primarying Joe Biden and they think, but Joe's already progressive. So it's an effective line of propaganda, insofar as it kind of muzzles and defangs the left. It's not effective in the sense that I don't think that helps Joe against the Republicans, because it's so obviously untrue that by the time we get to a general election, it's hard to sort of carry that message through. And they then want to pivot to the center and all this bullshit. But unfortunately, what that kind of messaging does is somewhat defang progressives as we try to primary these establishment corporate type candidates. So another huge story was Derek Chauvin being sentenced. I'm going to show you guys an article here in the Associated Press. I'm sure many of you already have seen this. Chauvin gets 22 and a half years in prison for George Floyd's death. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was sentenced Friday to 22 and a half years in prison for the murder of George Floyd, whose dying gasps under Chauvin's knee led to the biggest outcry against racial injustice in the U.S. in generations. The punishment, which came after Chauvin broke his year-long silence to offer condolences to the Floyd family and express hope that they eventually have some peace of mind, is one of the longest prison terms ever imposed on a U.S. police officer in the killing of a Black person. Still, Floyd family members and others were disappointed. The sentence fell short of the 30 years prosecutors had requested, and with good behavior, Chauvin, 45, could get out on parole after serving 2/3 of his sentence, or about 15 years. Quote, just because it's the most time doesn't mean it's enough time. That is exactly correct. So I want to draw a comparison here. I wish I would have brought this tweet up to have for you guys, but someone compared that sentence. They put an article of Chauvin's sentence up next to an article of a Black man who was denied parole and will now serve the rest of his life in prison for a marijuana charge. We have a long way to go. And by the way, Derek Chauvin being treated as some sort of outsider, like they very effectively sort of detached him from police. They treated him as though he was like somehow separate of and distinct from the problem of police brutality, when in fact he was an instrumental part. He's indicative of the problem. Derek Chauvin had a dozen plus complaints. He had been involved in shootings and deaths before, and for all of this, he was promoted to training officer and given more authority in the field. Minneapolis Police Department is culpable for that. And it's indicative of a deeper problem with police, whereby that kind of conduct is protected. And, you know, when the department felt the need to cast him aside, that was also out of their own defense. It's not like these cops all of a sudden were disgusted by what Derek Chauvin did, right? They like promoted him, kept him on the force. So you don't get to just suddenly do this like, oh no, he's awful, when you've contributed to his being in a position to be violent to Floyd in the first place. And this is why reform is not enough, or anything close to enough. Minneapolis police was one of the first departments to take all of the recommendations from the Obama administration on police reform. How'd that work? Not only did they kill Floyd, they've killed a couple others just since Floyd. And then they responded horribly to the protests. How'd that work? How'd the reform work? Doesn't. They need to be defunded and abolished and replaced. And that's all there is to it. Police unions will fight tooth and nail against any and all actually substantive reforms. They have to be cast aside. Okay? That's the only way that we're going to be able to create a department of public safety that is actually held to some kind of account and is not acting as an oppressive and violent force in and of themselves. So police are a institutional problem, not a good apple, bad apple problem. But it was very clear in the Chauvin case that Minneapolis police and all of the police expert witnesses they brought up and all of the people on the media, you know, wanted to cast him out as a bad apple. Oh yeah, no, we got some bad apples. No. You let that apple spoil the whole bag. People like to forget the rest of that saying, right? If you have one bad apple, it spoils the whole bag. So when you promote a guy like that to training, what's that do? And again, that's just one anecdotal case. This is indicative of a significantly deeper underlying problem. We can go through the numbers over and over, guys. I talk about this all the time. Well over 1,000 people, something in the neighborhood of 1,300 people killed every year by police in this country. Other countries simply do not even approach that number. Even like China and India, who have higher populations, do not come anywhere close to that number. So it's a significant problem. We also have about 5% of the world's population. We have like a quarter of the world's incarcerated population. So in every way, our system is significantly worse, significantly more barbaric, significantly more oppressive than virtually every other system in the world. And that is the point. And that's what we need to address and deal with. And these all connect, you guys, to deeper societal problems where we also oppress economically, right? We have later today, I have a pre-recorded clip that I'm looking forward to showing you guys with Irami Osei-Frimpong. He taught critical race theory and some of the other ways that the Black community is impacted outside of what is technically on the books, right? So that's important to keep in mind when it comes to policing too. And the fact that, I think yesterday or the day before would have been Tamir Rice's birthday. And the fact that Juneteenth just happened as well. And we have decided to make that a holiday while Biden wants to increase funding for police. That is contradictory. That is hypocrisy at its finest. And I'm urging my viewers not to fall for it. So, want to do one more story here before I bring in one of my guests today. Amazon was busted destroying a whole bunch of product. This story is from the UK, but I think it's very likely that it translates to other parts of the world where they operate as well. Reading here from Business Insider. One Amazon warehouse destroys 130,000 items per week, including MacBooks, COVID-19 masks, and TVs, some of them new and unused, a report says. An Amazon warehouse in Scotland destroys millions of unsold products every year, an investigation from the British news outlet ITV found. ITV filmed undercover footage inside Amazon's warehouse in Dunfermline. Oh my God, I'm sure I'm butchering that, Scotland. The footage showed laptops, TVs, jewelry, headphones, books, and face masks being loaded into crates marked destroy. And their target, this is according to, I'll read further here. An anonymous former Amazon employee told ITV that workers at the warehouse were given a weekly target of 130,000 items to destroy. This was corroborated by an internal memo viewed by ITV, which showed that during 1 week in April, 124,000 items were marked destroy. In the same week, 28,000 products were marked donate. So Amazon here finding it more financially expedient to destroy product to keep the price high of other product that they do have to sell is effectively what is happening. And that is a perfect example of the kind of symptom that capitalism creates, where the goal is not like how many people could use some nice new technology or a COVID-19 mask or any of the other plethora of things that Amazon sells and likely destroys when they have too high an inventory of. That's just disgusting, you guys. It's just disgusting. Think about how many people you see every day outside who might need some fucking help and could use some of these materials. And Amazon, instead of donating them, destroys them because it's cheaper to. They also lied about this. They have said repeatedly when asked how many items they destroy, they've really minimized it, said it's hardly any. We try to donate everything that we can. We don't destroy many things at all. Well, there's your answer. 130,000 a week and only 20-some thousand are marked to donate. And again, I want to clarify that was in the UK, but I think it's very unlikely that Amazon is behaving in significantly different ways in different parts of the planet. And if there was a country that was going to allow this kind of conduct, it would certainly be the United States. So I have no doubt that they're conducting themselves in similar ways. And this just continues the pretty clear picture that Amazon has painted as to what their actual business model and business practices are. They union bust left and right. They lie online. They use propaganda that tries to imply that they pay high wages and treat their workers well, when we all know that that couldn't be farther from the truth. They're one of the worst companies to work for in the country. They drag wages down for warehouse workers, for drivers. Then they treat those workers poorly and refuse to let them unionize. Drivers, of course, this was the Ken Klippenstein called out Dave Clark on Twitter, going back a couple months here, but Dave Clark denied that drivers were pissing and shitting in bottles to make delivery times. And Ken Klippenstein went and put together a whole list of the evidence and proof that actually was happening. Numerous drivers making these claims, pictures, et cetera, et cetera. Amazon just doesn't give a shit about humanity. They care about their profit. They are, again, it's capitalism run amok. And this is, for those who want to say that like capitalism is somehow efficient or that it somehow is the best of a number of bad options or any of these kinds of lazy arguments, this is an example that blows all of that up. If by efficiency you mean let's leave significant chunks of our population out to dry while the wealthy have efficient access to the goods and services that they desire, well, then capitalism might be perfect for you. But if by efficiency you mean a society that actually treats people with some form of equity or takes care of everybody or provides what it's able to provide to everybody, then capitalism is the exact opposite of what you want. And Amazon doing a great, fantastic job of proving that point with this story and with a whole number of others. The Bessemer situation, you guys, where they set up an illegal mailbox during the union vote and then monitored that mailbox. It's just, we can go on and on and on and on and on. I covered the story about how they had a workplace injury problem. So instead of making the work less strenuous or treating their employees better, what they did is they started rotating who was doing what job. So you'd fuck up different parts of your body different days. Basically, they wanted to just get as many working hours out of you as possible before you crumble into a ball of arthritis and pulled muscles and joint problems and whatever else. And then you can fuck off. You've given us all the labor that you can. We gave you as little as we possibly could in compensation, and now you can fuck off. Amazon has an incredibly high turnover rate. That does not happen for companies that are good to work for. Their turnover rate some years is over 100%. So it's people don't last at Amazon because it's a terrible place to fucking work. Unfortunately, they are on pace to become the biggest employer in the country behind, obviously, public jobs. There are a lot of public jobs, but Walmart is the top private employer in the country right now, followed by Amazon. Really two great companies, right, guys? Just who you want your loved ones working for and reliant upon to maintain any sort of quality of life, right? Really, really quite too bad. One more quick here, corporate story, actually. American Airlines has canceled a whole ton of flights. And what actually happened here is when the pandemic hit, we provided airlines with a separate bailout. So they didn't have to go through the same paycheck protection program that other businesses did and other industries did. The airlines got their own special $5 billion bailout. And then there was a date, I think it was 1st of September or the 1st of October, I don't remember, but last fall, where they were then, so let me take one step back, I'm sorry. That bailout was conditioned. You have to use this to keep your employees on. But then there was a date that you were then allowed to fire your employees. And I think it was 1st of September. It might have been 1st of October. Of course, predictable as hell, when that date came, these airlines who had taken a whole shitload of money then fired their employees en masse. Lots of them gone. Well, now American Airlines is canceling a bunch of flights and claiming that they have to do so because of an employee shortage. A shortage they themselves created. You go fire a bunch of your employees and then turn around and tell the customers, sorry, we can't serve you because we fired a bunch of our employees while we were taking public money as a bailout. This again, pair this with that last story from Amazon. This is capitalism run amok. And this is what happens when your government is taken over by corruption. This is what happens when the Jeff Bezoses of the world can bid for a space contract, knowing even if they lose it, that the Senate would be willing to bail them out. This, again, if you think about these stories as you're walking by like the homeless person on the street, you know, it becomes very clear how intentionally our society is designed this way and how egregiously corrupt our government actually is. So the airline industry, one of the worst. They lobby quite a bit because they rely on they really rely on the institution of government for what they're doing, because obviously things are regulated on an airplane. You know, airports are heavily involved with transportation departments, and you know, there's all sorts of TSA, all sorts of, so their industry is deeply intertwined with regulation agencies and with the federal and local governments. So they end up lobbying quite a bit to kind of maintain their ability to screw over their workers and customers. And it is, to be totally fair, generally it's not an industry with a large profit margin unless you get big enough. So it's like a tricky industry to operate within, but that does not give American Airlines the right to take both sides of this. When you're getting bailed out to keep your employees on payroll, and then you turn around at the end of this and say, we don't have enough employees because we fired them while we were taking federal money, then that's your fucking fault. You deserve no sympathy. And in fact, your business really should just crumble. You clearly don't deserve to be a successful business if this is the way that you're going to make your decisions. So this shame on American Airlines and really the airline industry as a whole. I saw Southwest canceling flights too, and I'm sure that the story is almost identical there. These major airlines are quite problematic, and it's also a little bit tricky in the sense that like they're one of the major polluters, right? Like tons of jet fuel being burned on every flight. And yet, like, I think we all acknowledge that we need an airline industry. It's a tricky, you know, situation. We don't have, if we had green airplanes, that would be one thing. But it's just in general, the airline industry is a little bit tricky for progressives to deal with. But American Airlines clearly showing their capitalistic tendencies and their rapacious tendencies and how they will behave if they're allowed to. And this is, you know, you give a company like that an inch and they take a mile, because they know full well that they're too big for the government to let them fail. So even if they're behaving in horrendous ways, they know that the government will not punish them for that behavior and will continue to bail them out and give them every regulatory gift that they want. So just another crazy story about how capitalism screws workers and screws customers to the benefit of the executives and the shareholders. So shame on American Airlines there. At this point, I would like to bring in my first guest today. He's a friend of the show. Many of you will recognize Vinay Orekondy. Vinay is a lawyer and progressive activist, and always happy to talk with him. We're going to talk a little bit about the identity of the movement today. Vinay, thank you so much for taking the time.
Hi, Luke. Good to hear from you again. Thanks for having me on.
So you wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of the philosophy and identity of the progressive movement, but we wanted to start maybe by explaining how this has been an integral part of conservatives finding some success. So can you kind of explain what you mean by that? What identity do you see Republicans kind of embracing, or the conservative movement embracing, and how has that led to some electoral success and societal power?
Yeah, sure. So it depends which breed of Republicans you're talking about. So let's zoom out to the big picture. In fact, before we even answer that question, let's zoom out to sort of a prefacing thing I want to say. So often that, like, some of the philosophical stuff, I get these discussions don't happen very often in progressive circles. And I understand why. It's because, you know, we're dealing with, does this person get to eat or not? Right? That's so, you know, questions of philosophy seem a bit bourgeois and, you know, privilege really to have those discussions. But I think as we've kind of set ourselves up as a movement, and if we want to win in the long run, we have to engage with these questions, right? And we'll get into why. But the truth is that like ultimately, we can't organize based on anger alone. Anger is necessary to get us started. It's necessary to pull us together because it means we've got a shared interest. But ultimately, if we want to persuade a majority of people, we have to present a compelling vision to the world. And to do that, we have to get our philosophy straight. So that's why these questions are important in the medium to long term if you really want to win. So to answer your question, unless you have any thoughts on that, I'll go and answer your question. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you right now.
Thank you for letting me know. I was going to ask if, do you think this is an area where progressives have sort of failed, or do you view that as like you kind of started with like a natural, our ideology lends us to deal with this extremely desperate situation instead of having these big picture conversations?
Right. No, I don't think we failed there. I think actually this is how a movement has to start with anger. Like the union motto, at least in Australia, the union motto is anger, hope, action, right? Literally, that's the sequence, right? People are pissed off about a situation, right? They're angry. That's how you help them, and they're individually pissed off, right? And a good organizer goes in and, hey, look, you're not the only one that's pissed off. I've spoken to like 10 other people who are pissed off. Right. And so your anger is validated, right? It's not just you, right? So, and then, but here we have a solution, right? Either it's someone else's solution or they come up with it as a group. So that's the hope section, right? And then you actually have to act on it. That's action, right? So I think we've done very well in that first stage. Like I think progressives are pissed off. I think we've organized pretty well. We self-identify as a movement to some extent. We've had a few good, presidential runs, and I think we're getting people elected now on a local level. That's excellent. So now we've got to start moving towards that second level, the hope stage, right? And it's a hard transition to make because, it's because it requires these kinds of conversations, right? And saying, what is it that people can hope towards? So, and there's a few components. If you break that down, hope means for the people who are desperate and who you're organizing, right? But also for those who are outside of that space, right? So if you think about it, like to truly to win, we've got to win over 50% plus one, right? That's the rule. Yeah. So we can't have a philosophy that is only appealing to those who have been fucked over by the system, right? It has to meet their needs, but we have to find a way to kind of bring some others in without compromising anything. So that's the challenge, right? Is because too often in that when you're having those discussions, people say, well, let's compromise on the needs of those who, and that's not what we're presenting an alternative vision. We need to present an alternative vision which 100% meets the needs of those who we started with, right? But can also bring others in, right? So this is a tricky question, and it requires some nuance and it requires some big picture discussions.
Yeah, I think I often see establishment, especially Democrats, but really establishment people across the aisle that will say things like when we argue for more, that will say, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, right? And that's kind of that argument where it's like we're gonna leave some people out so that we can go forward with this whatever policy or discussion it might be. So can you maybe set the stage on this? And you said you wanted to take it a couple layers back. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So I think it's important, in order to understand what's been going on in the world right now and why the world looks like it does. I think it's, certainly if you watch the news or whatever, you can think the world is in chaos right now and everything is going mad. There's actually a very clear explanation for everything that's going on, right? Is that since the 80s, Margaret Thatcher famously said, and Ronald Reagan copied her, is saying that there is no such thing as society. There's only a collection of individuals, right? And unfortunately, that philosophy took root, right? And then we had the 80s, right? And that's essentially if you want to understand the world since the 80s, you go back to that statement, right? And what you have there is a philosophy that the philosophy of individualism at its heart, right? And this is even deeper than capitalism itself, because capitalism predates Thatcherism, right? This is actually a moral philosophy. It's like the idea that I, as an individual, exist separately from the world around me. I exist. I can choose to have, community. I can choose to have family, but really, ultimately, the only thing that exists is me. And ultimately, all that matters is, aggrandizing myself, accumulating material power for myself. And if you can say that, like, that has been the world since the 1980s, right? And
Yeah.
what does that mean? Like, it's actually quite a profound idea if you think about it, because it's saying that the self, the individual self, is the center of the universe, right?
Yeah.
And that shocks us both. But like, if we really think about that, like, that's actually what it means, is that we were born into this world as this thing which is in an end of itself. Even though, we're born and we die, doesn't matter. This philosophy is me, my ego, myself is the end goal. Now imagine spreading that philosophy to whatever the population of the planet is right now. Is it 6 billion or is it more? It's probably more now.
A little more, but something like that. Yeah.
Right. So 7 billion people climbing over each other, trying to be the one, right? That's the philosophy we've got that's dominating the planet right now. So it's no reason, and obviously only some can win in that, and very few can win. So I think that explains how we got to a state where wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few people, and a handful of people across the planet, because they'd set up this game where the individual is paramount. Only certain people can win that game. Therefore, most have lost. Right? Is that making sense so far?
That 100% makes sense to me. And it seems to me that sort of philosophy actually by identity requires a lot of people to lose. I think Mark Blythe says for every rich man, there must be 10,000 poor, because wealth is relative, right? So do you think that sort of philosophy has almost created an environment whereby people who are not succeeding in this system will accept it, even though it's to their own detriment? Do you think that creates an environment where people are unable to sort of pull themselves out of this mindset to better society for themselves?
I think it did in the 90s and it did in the 2000s, but I think that is falling away. And I think that actually is a good segue into what's been happening more recently, is because you can only, ultimately, community is a human need, right? It's something that's in our DNA. And I think especially when the world is a threatening place, right? If the world may have been, and the world has become a lot more threatening since the 2000s, right? For various reasons, environmental disasters and terrorism and more wars, right? And so what we instinctively respond by forming community, right? That's strength in numbers. It's one of the oldest things. So what has happened is that it's triggered existing collective responses, right? And what are the most obvious collective responses that already existed in our collective consciousness? The nation, religion, race, right? So the new brand of conservatism is actually a direct response to the old brand, right? You can, it's a trigger response, because human beings, you can only be stretched and be told the individual is king for so long and be lose out. And those groups will find each other, the people have lost, and then say, well, this is all bullshit. So who do you turn to? Someone who is got a ready-made collective response, right? And it was and often that was on the internet, the people in the dark corners of the internet preaching racism and whatnot. So, or religious groups are out there, or whatever. So for me, the move towards right-wing authoritarianism is crystal clear to me. It's so obvious why this has happened.
And so what would be then sort of a way to get progressives to engage in more of a group mentality about this stuff? And is that what you mean by saying we need more of an identity that people can actually relate to, and sort of, this is my tribe, or however you want to kind of think about that? We all have, I think all of the viewers at home probably have a few areas in their life, whether that's through your career, or your hobbies, or your family, or your religion, or your community locally, like literally just local community. People all kind of have like a tribe that I'm part of this, right? Like this is something I'm part of. Do you think progressives need to form something more like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, look, it's interesting you mentioned career, because I think people used to really have that in their career, but I think it's a lot harder now, given that workplaces are some of the most fiercely individualistic places around, right? It's actually
Oh,
very
that's
hard
interesting. Yeah.
to form a community there, even though we spend like 40 hours a week in our workplace, right? Although interesting how COVID may have changed that, because
Yes.
now we may have actually, because, at least for remote workers, at least they may have the opportunity to, form communities with their local environments. And I've heard of stories of that starting to happen much more. But yes, ultimately, in order to we need to provide an answer to so clearly the world has become quite disillusioned, I think, at large, with this idea that the individual is king, right? And right now, because we and I'll tell you why I think we haven't met the answer yet, right? The right have had an answer ready to go. They've had those answers ready for thousands of years, right? They were just able to pull them up straight away. They were ready to go and throw them at this highly individualized world. Say, look, this is our collective response, right? But clearly, it's obviously out of touch with the values of you, I, and your listeners, right? So that's why we've often probably felt out of place. But also, it's not very effective governance either, right? Like, you look at the result, you get like Trump or Bolsonaro, and they can't navigate the complexities of the 21st century. They're just not able to. So this provides an opportunity for progressives to present a third way, I guess. So without the connotation, sorry, I realize that.
No, without the term third way, I get what you're saying.
Right. So we have to present an alternative, both, the individualism of, the 80s to the kind of the collectivist, yet nationalist right-wing versions of whatever is happening in the last 10 years or so. We've got to provide our own alternative. Now, the reason we haven't succeeded so far is, and this is the key point, is that where the right have succeeded and progressives have not, is the right are willing to engage with the big questions, right, in their own way. They go for questions about religion, right? Religion, in fact, I would argue that religion is the core of the new right, even though, there's a lot of talk about them being racist, and they are, there's a lot of that too, but I actually think religion is what holds it together. Now, why is that important? Because it's about, we go back to that question of individualism, right? That is about defining your relationship with the universe. Like, the self, I exist separately from the universe, right? That's how an individualist thinks. Whereas a religious person will think, well, I'm here, and obviously I'm generalizing, but say I'm here to serve God and my community, right? And that changes how you interact with your community, right? So, whereas I believe that progressives are still, we're so shy from engaging in those conversations that we're not able to grab people at that level, right? Because we engage in material discussions, and I get it, because there's someone literally starving right next to us, right? So of course we're going to want to engage, but it's not enough to win in the long run, because we have to engage those core material, those core spiritual assumptions, really, about and ask, as a progressive, what is our relationship with the universe, right? That will in turn define our political and economic relationships.
I think that's a really important point. And actually, one of my favorite quotes, and I'm sure I won't get it word for word, but Carl Sagan said something about, we are all literally made up of the byproduct of billions of stars. So right. To think of yourself as separate of the universe is, even on a physical level, not an accurate way to look at things, right? Or the other thing he said was, you are the universe experiencing itself. And I think that's also a very sort of, I don't know, just kind of a brilliant way to look at things. But how then to transition into how we effectively do this? Is this something that you think will happen? Like you mentioned COVID and people thinking differently about their lives and their workplace and their interaction with their society, if you will. Do you think this can kind of happen organically, or do you think this is going to take progressive leadership or some combination of the two to create this sort of I don't want to use the word tribe because it sounds so, you know, how we talk about those things, but like kind of a tribe where people can feel at home. This is my group. I don't have to be alone. This is my, you know what I mean? The feel of a community.
Right. Look, I think some of it will happen organically, right? But I think that it will also take leadership to catalyze that process and speed it up, right? Like some of it is already happening, right? Even the, you know, groups coming together and forming, you know, and like I think like I don't want to, and I also don't want to undercut the importance of that, of, you know, material philosophy, right? Like and you know, because, you know, a group coming together to feed each other is creating a space where these kind of discussions can happen. So this is, it's obviously all extremely important, but I just want to kind of say, well, we have to go beyond that now, right? And so does it take leadership? Yes, it will. And it's going to take us willing to challenge our own thinking, right? And it's specifically, you know, about identity, right? Like, so for a start, like, I think that we should be okay with the idea of saying that progressive is an identity in the world, right? Or I mean, and that's the term, I call myself a progressive. That's actually my fundamental identity, right? And that's, you know, go back like say 10, 15 years, that wouldn't necessarily have made sense as an identity in relation to the world, right? But I think that where the world is right now, it does make sense as a tribe because that is indicative of my values, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is that, and I'm just going to say, it's like we have to be willing to explore really unusual places for us to find a justification for those values. Like we have to be willing to look to philosophy, to religion, right? To find like what are progressive values, right? One, what are they? And two, can we justify them intellectually? Like we have like the you know, the debates of old that philosophers used to have, and say, yes, well, this makes sense to me. This is why I hold these values. I believe I can. I'm comfortable with my values, and I'll say for me, my values come from Buddhism and, you know, from various Asian religions, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about them. For me, they are the source of my progressive values, because of the way they argue and engage with, you know, our relationship with the universe. But, you know, that's a discussion I'm willing to have, right? And I think that what's the difference between, like, I know for me, for example, I've been quite shy about talking about this stuff publicly before, right? Because I know that, you know, in progressive spaces, we often run away from religion, right? Understandably, like it's, you know, religion has often been our opponent for so long, but I don't think we can anymore. I think the difference is, though, that we'll get there by discussing this stuff together and persuading one another, because that's the way we do things.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think my sort of objection to religion is less an objection to the concept of religion, as I mean, I'm pretty personally, I'm pretty atheist. I really believe the sort of scientific explanation of the start of the universe and these kinds of things, right? But at the same time, part of, like, I don't have a problem with belief systems in general. My objection to religion is more like what's literally in the text sometimes, or the way that they have conducted themselves in oppressive ways. Like I got a problem with like the institution of the Catholic Church, for example, not an average Catholic who's trying to find some fulfillment and meaning in their life, right? So you said you talked about the sort of the Eastern religions and philosophies. Can you just, and I know some of these might sound really, I don't know, corny or what, but can you just, what values specifically are those? Like, I think lefties it's compassion, it's love, it's caring, right? And I know that all sounds kind of hippie, funky, whatever you want to, you know, but can you just talk about what those values actually mean and why they're so important to us?
Sure. So I think there are two key I guess for me, there are two concepts that I took out of, and I'm just going to say Buddhism, but it actually, because just as a shorthand, but it also includes Taoism, and if you get into the guts of it, it also includes Hinduism as well. But I'll just say Buddhism because that's probably the most clear articulation of these ideas. The two things that I've extracted the most out of it is one, that everything in the universe is impermanent, nothing is fixed, right? And the second is that, and as a result of that, it's insanity for us to attach our identity to anything within that universe. So, so for example, if I define myself by the size of my house, that is irrational because a house is an impermanent thing, right? Or if I define myself by the number of workers I employ, right? Or the amount of money I have, that doesn't make sense because those are impermanent states of being. And they draw their decision on impermanence, just from observation. And I guess that's something that a physicist would agree with too, is that nothing in the universe is fixed, right? Even like we used to think that atoms are fixed, but atoms can be broken apart, right? So the idea is that if you start with the assumption that nothing is fixed in the universe, then we shouldn't attach our identity to anything within that universe, right? That's the first thing. And if you think about it, that's actually an extremely progressive position, right? Because what does progression mean? It means change, right? So, and the opposition of change is attachment to certain ideas or things and status quo. So that's the first thing, the idea that nothing is fixed in the universe. The second thing is that what do? We still have an identity. We still exist, right? We're still here. We can't just not have an identity. Otherwise, we would just die, right? Identity exists for a reason. It's a survival mechanism. So the Buddhist response is, well, if you can't attach yourself to anything within that universe, then the only rational or logical identity to have is that of the universe as a whole. Right? So, and this is where, so that's like the idea of I'm one with everything, right? I am the universe, or to put it to quote Carl Sagan, I am the universe experiencing itself.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the second thing is that, so first, nothing within the universe is fixed. Therefore, the only national identity is to identify as the universe as a whole. And that leads you to the third conclusion is, well, how do you do that, right? So first, it's a process of intellectual deconstruction of any ideas or material things or people or whatever that we're attached to. But second is replacing it with love, really. That's it. Emotion, compassion towards everything as a collective whole. That is how you identify with the universe as a whole, is through universal love, right? And so what does that mean? Is that to conclude that sort of lengthy thing is that one, it doesn't make sense to attach yourself to anything within the universe. Two, the only rational identity is to identify as a universe as a whole. And three, it's the way you do that is by, showing that identification is by love for the universe as a whole, right? And for me, yes, one, that is Buddhism, but two, that is progressivism to me. That's for me is that defines my relationship with the world. That defines my political and economic beliefs. And I think ideas like that could be useful in helping us as progressives define what our relationship with the universe is, so that we can be persuasive. And I think because we have to provide, it doesn't matter if that's not the answer, that's fine. I need to make that clear, right? But we have to provide avenue for people to have these discussions or, engage in this way. Otherwise, we'll never get people on that level.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I do think you draw a very interesting distinction in the sense that, and you were talking about religion in maybe a different context, but I do think the more conservative interpretation of religion does rely on somewhat of a fixed view of reality. right? That it's not going anywhere, that you're going to go to heaven and then you're going to experience this, you know what I mean? Like that's all fixed. What's going to happen to you is all fixed and defined. And, you know, I do think there's an element of that, and we need to sort of take a compassionate way of looking at things the other way. And just for those who, I went down in a rabbit hole a few months back where I was listening to all these like physicists and quantum mechanic people and like Sean Carroll and Brian Greene and Brian Cox. And I just got fascinated by the origin story. And just for those who don't understand what Vinay means by the impermanence, it's a well-established fact in physics that in trillions and trillions of years, the universe will have nothing in it. For a while, there will be nothing but black holes, and then there will be nothing. And at that point, the way that Brian Greene puts it, there won't even be enough heat for thought to exist. So not only will we no longer exist and have no recollection of existing, but no theoretical living thing could even analyze our existence or understand that we did exist, right? And I think that's a deeply humbling thought. I actually like to think about that when I'm struggling with something in my life. It's kind of like, what's it going to mean in 10 trillion years? You know what I mean? So that's the impermanence that you're talking about there is a very physical reality. But and I just want to make sure that the viewers understood you're being very, you know, scientifically accurate in that interpretation of the universe. But can you discuss how we connect these ideals and these bases for community to our current political views? I mean, I find it very compassionate and loving to feed a homeless person, right? I find it very compassionate and loving to work on housing reform or healthcare reform, or to try to fix the environmental catastrophe that we have coming. So how do we effectively what's the connective tissue there that might help us build the movement?
Right. So this is where we can actually get deeper into the relationship between this and the political philosophy, right? So you think like, so that what they you know, if you go through a journey to get to that sort of state of mind, you go through ironically you go through an individual journey, right? They speak about, like, you know, deconstructing your beliefs and then expanding your mind to to love the universe, right? So that is an individual journey towards a collective end. And what that means, though, is that it respects the freedom of people to go on that journey. And it's vital that people be free to go on that journey. And this is why it's a very anti-authoritarian philosophy, right? Because you can't tell people what to think, right? But ultimately there is a logical endpoint to arrive at, which is to the service of others. So what does that mean? It means it lends itself towards communities, the creation of communities that give enough individual freedom and flexibility to, for people to think as they wish, right? But also to end at a kind of a place where of service of others, right? So in many ways, it lends itself towards kind of anarchist communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously that's because there is a sense of the collective there. It's if someone is actually using that individual freedom to harm others in any way or exploit others in any way, then the collective should act, right? And expel that person from the community, right?
Right.
So
right.
It's not like the individual is not the end in of itself, and that's critical, right? Because as the philosophy says, that the collective is the end goal, but it's an individual journey towards that collective end goal. So the beauty of this philosophy is that I think it strikes a nice balance between individualism and collectivism, right? It allows us to, the space to find ourselves, but it always is pointing in the direction of service of others, right? It's also, and it's quite a decentralized philosophy as well, right? Because it's about, because it's part of the individual journey, it encourages creativity, it encourages exploration, encourages free thinking.
So I think one of the pushbacks to this kind of narrative will be predictably kind of what you were just talking about, and it's not that this is a rational response to this, but I see conservatives sort of pushing back to that by saying, oh, that's communism. That's, you know what I mean? That's this collective sort of, and sort of saying that in a derogatory sense, not in a, that's a community working together kind of sense. So how do you think that we can, and this might be a few steps ahead, of where we currently are, but how do you see us engaging in that on, all sorts of levels, because we'll have to combat that on sort of a macro political level and also on sort of a community level, and just building what we're trying to build regardless of what's being said, right? How do you see us sort of, I think we're swimming upstream on a lot of these ideas, and how do we kind of keep swimming?
Yeah, sure. So I think look, ultimately, for all this just talk of philosophy, I'm a believer in action. I think action is the most important thing. The way we do it is we test these ideas, we test them on a local level and show what they really are. That is by far the most effective thing we can do. Having said that, we still obviously have to have the intellectual discussion as well. And like what I think that the greatest fear of communism is the authoritarian aspect of it. I've made no secret of the fact that I am anti-authoritarian, right? And I strongly am opposed to authoritarianism. And the reason is because I don't think that we could ever get to a place of wanting to serve others if if our civil and political rights are being squashed, right? Like we have to, obviously, there is the collective has to take action to prevent harm, right? And, or in case of, like when there's enormous inequity going on, the collective must take action. But we can't actually suppress people's thinking. Like I think that's a huge problem. So what we've got to do is emphasize the nature of, I think, like, so if someone comes and says, oh, that's communism, and I say, well, look, who is being forced to do anything here? Most of these communities will be opt-in, right? Because that's how these things will start, right? Or, I mean, they already exist, really. Like people opt into them. If they want to leave, they're welcome to, right? Nobody's being communized, right? It's just people acting together of their own volition. That's as well, interestingly. So the truth is that when these things are forming out of, like, on the ground, out of people of their own volition, there's no argument to be made that it's communism. Now, will that persuade everyone? No, of course, because people will just see any kind of collective and they'll say, oh, well, that's communism. We're not going to win every argument. I'm here to get 50% plus one.
50% plus one. I like that. And do you think that this is something that we're, because like when you talk about those ideals, what's so interesting to me is I think a lot of people would outwardly portray themselves as embracing those ideals, right? Compassion, caring, love, community, right? But perhaps don't see that they're not acting on them in their political views, or when they vote, or when we engage in societies in ways that impact others, right? So how do you think we can sort of connect what are words that I think a lot of people like to use and like to think of themselves as having embracing? How do you connect that to the action of the progressive political platform? How do we draw that line?
This is where leadership is very important, because I feel like what this discussion is doing is all we're doing is drawing to the surface stuff that happens unconsciously for a lot of people, right? So like these unconscious processes and discussions that I had. So what leaders need to do is actually make this stuff conscious, saying like, because I believe in X, I will be doing X, right? So for example, because I believe in that my identity is one with the universe, therefore I am going to dedicate my life to setting up a collective where people feed each other, right? So drawing really, really direct links between the esoteric and the material again and again and again and again, so that people see that it's practical and real. Because the reason why philosophy gets dismissed is because it doesn't connect to, can I eat today or not, right?
It's so abstract, right? It's a discussion that's in this other arena. Yeah.
Yeah, and even if people aren't, struggling to survive, they still they might have to work 40 hours, like a middle class person might be, well, I work 40 hours a week, I don't have time. That's still actually a material question, right? Because they have to give all their time and labor towards their work, right? So it's still a question of materialism. So what we have to do is the leadership of the progressive movement has to be willing to draw very concrete connections between the esoteric and the material, right? So for another example, I'll give two examples of this. One is, you see increasingly a lot of like middle-class people or millennials who are like burnt out by the corporate world and they just kind of want to go live in the country, right? So what I think they're a group of people that I would like engage with and saying, look, what is it that you were burnt out about the corporate world, right? Is that, and I think it's because they were worked like slaves, like, and in this highly individualistic, anti-community environment, right? Which goes against our fundamental nature. So it's worth finding people who are rejecting that system for various reasons and helping them understand what's really going on and then drawing that link to the esoteric so that they can go on to create practical manifestations of that esoteric thing. Because the thing is that an economy that was based on this philosophy would look totally different to the economy that we've got today. Totally different, right? So we've got to make that clear. We have to find all the practical steps possible. So again, I've talked on your show in the past about employee-owned collectives, right? Yeah. I believe they are the way that we change the world, right? And for me, they're a direct economic reflection of all this philosophy.
Yeah, I think I'm big on that too. I think that workers should have significantly more say in their workplace and we need to start taking steps towards that direction. That's a huge one because it would actually affect the power structure of our society in ways that a lot of other things do not. And to just tie in, you're talking about sort of tying the value to the policy. And I just want to point out how effective conservatives are at this. They will use most notably the Bible, right? To say, because I believe this, I'm going to oppose abortion. Because I believe this, I believe in the death penalty. And even when those are, I often completely illogical connections, the Bible actually at one point prescribes an abortion. So even though there's some detachment there in the actual ideal and the policy, they very effectively link them rhetorically to voters, right? And they have this community base that then responds to that, where even if there might be a little bit of policy disagreement in a primary or something like that, Republicans all seem to get in line behind this sort of community identity culture thing when it comes to the general election. So I was going to ask you to talk a little bit about Nina Turner, who I think, and you mentioned she does a little bit of what you're kind of talking about. How is she using that kind of strategy for progressive gains?
Yeah, I was just about to mention her. So she's obviously she's not out there talking about philosophy, and that's fine. That's a good thing. That would go against it. But she is when she says, she doesn't hesitate to say, look, it's all about love, right? It's all about love, and people have embraced that. I think in the past we might have gone, oh, that's corny or whatever, but she pulls it off and she does it well. Now, if someone eventually at some point, I think she's going to get elected. I think she's run a good race.
It's not even close. She's going to win.
Right. Okay. So let's just once she gets in, right, to Congress, she's going to get attacked, and there'll be people who will, attack her and laugh at her and say, oh, look, it's all about love. And I'll see all the conservative memes popping up and making fun of her for that. So that's when we'll have to be able to defend it intellectually, right? We'll have to say, well, actually, no, it really is about love. And I say that as a hardline rationalist who has spent my life trying to understand my relationship with the universe in a philosophical sense, right? Is that really is about love, right? And it's not just some hippie bullshit that we inherited from the 1960s, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
So
do you think? Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say. So she's laying a pathway for us, right? And I'm really happy. And yeah, she's going to get attacked for it and harshly for it. So we have to be able to come and defend that and that position.
Do you think that I'm wondering if there might be some room here for, I could see two answers to this question. So I'm curious to see what you think, because I can kind of see both sides of this. Do you think that some of that messaging, if properly packaged, could actually win over some conservatives on the basis of, hey, what would Jesus do? Would he love his fellow homeless, member of the community? Would he, etc.? Or do you think that there are these sort of almost invisible culture lines that will like prevent a lot of that from being successful? Do you think that we can actually win some of our opponents over with this messaging, or do you think this is more to try to message to people who may be apolitical or who may be less involved than they may be otherwise, or these kinds of things?
I think there are certainly some will be there. There's some that will, like, I don't know exactly where the line is, but there is a line somewhere, right? That there are people we'll be able to win over. I remember recently, like in the last 10 years, there's been a growth in the evangelical left, for example. They've probably transitioned over already, but I think that we may be able to win more over, right? But I think we also shouldn't overestimate the number of like these activists. Like, our goal isn't to win over opposition activists, right? Like they're always the last people. Like, even though we'll often debate with them, right, or argue with them, it's not about winning them over. It's about winning over everyone who's watching, right? So I think ultimately everyone except a handful of people is persuadable, right? So we just have to present our case articulately, forcefully, and intelligibly, and and win over as many as we can, right? And the goal being that actually brings up a whole other question, right? Is in like, what is our end game here, right? Is it because I can understand I'm sure at least there's some people in the audience who are like, oh my God, he's talking about religion and persuading as many people as possible. This sounds like proselytizing, and that's I understand that fear. Like, I think our goal must be to articulate our own ideals, to create a space where we can live by those ideals and bring anyone in who wishes to live by those ideals, right?
Okay.
And we need to be able to defend that space from like outside incursion, right? Because I think that it's very easy for like such a space. Like, you look at one of the best examples of this in the world is in Syria, I don't know how to say it, the ROJAVA. They've actually created, do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I haven't heard about this. So go ahead and explain.
Rojava, I think, forgive me for mispronouncing it. They've actually created communities that look a lot like this, right? And then they got crushed by the Syrian government. Now, this is not an opinion on the Syrian civil war or anything like that, but what I'm just saying is that these kind of communities can be vulnerable to attack from more authoritarian regimes, right? So our goal must be to create that space. Essentially, our goal should be to create our own vision of utopia, right? And to live by it and know that it's going to be threatened from the outside. So we have to gain enough, political and economic strength to defend it. That is my vision for the future. I think that because I believe that the way the world moves forward is when you get conflicting visions of reality are allowed to test themselves, and ultimately the better ones will triumph in some way. If they're better in some way for that moment, they will triumph, right? If not immediately, in the long run. So if we believe in this vision, right, then we just have to make it real, right, for ourselves, right? And I think that as a Buddhist, my goal is to be happy, right? So, and I know that being in a space like that would make me happy. So that's why I'm doing this, right? I mean, and also because, I want to live for others, right, as part of these values. So I would create a space which welcomes those who are willing to work towards living shared values like that.
Yeah. So do you think, actually a couple of things. So first, do you think there's any value in trying to point out that, like, in my view, and this is totally anecdotal and I can't back this up, but in my view, even some of the most financially successful people in our society are actually deeply unhappy. And I think that has a lot to do with what they were taught success is, what values they worked towards, and what they prioritized in their life, right? You can be a multimillionaire and be depressed as hell. In fact, the top 1% has a really high suicide rate. So do you think there's a way that we could message sort of almost appeal to their I'll use the word selfishness, almost appeal to their individual tendency by saying, hey, you might actually get more fulfillment out of this kind of a structure and a society than you're currently getting, even if you don't get to be as, standout wealthy, or, is there value in that kind of messaging? Or do you think a lot of those capitalists are just kind of too far gone?
Again, my answer is both. I think that, you'll find that a lot of the people who will adopt this are burnt out upper middle class people, right, to begin with. In fact, if we're so people who have the resources and the time to engage in philosophy, right, like this, right, are probably burnt out middle class people, but they'll also have the resources to create communities like this. Now, I'm not talking in abstraction. Stuff like this is already happening, right? And so I think that you'll find a lot of, you will find a section of the people that we're fighting would actually be very attracted to this, right? You'll also find people that are not, right? That they're so, for whatever reason, they maybe they're true believers in individualism. Like they were just born that way, or they've intellectualized in their own mind, or for whatever reason, or they're just terrified of losing their power, right? Whatever the reason, they will just oppose it and they'll fight it tooth and nail to their grave, and we'll fight.
Yeah.
Right? But as long as we're open to winning a lot of them over at the same time, then I think that's how we win.
So how about a sensitive topic, or a topic that I think is often kind of considered sensitive, is that I often find the establishment Democrats to very disingenuously weaponize some of what you're talking about, where things like they'll put a pride flag up while they're opposing some piece of legislation that would benefit the LGBT community, or they'll paint Black Lives Matter in the streets while they're continuing to brutalize protesters, or some of the symbolic stuff where they seem to recognize that there's value in this kind of messaging. Do you think that if we embrace this type of community building around these kinds of identities and philosophies, do you think that we could poke a hole in some of that effectiveness of that kind of messaging if we tie it to our policy? Do you think we can kind of win over some of the people who may think liberally and genuinely embrace love and compassion and want better for their neighbors, but are currently somewhat stuck in an establishment cycle in terms of how they're living their lives?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, for me, this is also a question of, for me, ultimately, this is also a question of power, right? And I think that if we build, right now, progressives are just acting as a kind of a resistance within the, on the left, like we're resisting the mainstream. And I'm trying to argue that we need to go beyond being a resistance and actually present an alternative vision that we should execute. Now, as we do that, we present options to people, right?
Right.
That we start to control the conversation, right? We start to say, hang on, we start to create assumptions that people just hold on to, right? And that's ultimately what powerful, right? So you'll see, you'll see people just think, well, it's normal to go and help your community, right? Or to support them, or if you've got extra resources to help the people around you that don't have as much, that will just be normalized, right? And that world can exist.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting that we were all kind of taught culturally, or at least a lot of us were taught culturally growing up, to embrace these ideals. I mean, what's the message of every freaking Disney movie, right? And what's we're taught to embrace this idea of compassion and giving and helping and community. And then it seems like our society just doesn't mirror those ideals at all. And then as we grow up, we're almost accused of being wackos when we try to create a society that more aligns with the ideals that we were all kind of taught growing up. So what to you is the disconnect currently, right, in those two things, where we all are happy to teach our children to embrace the ideals you're talking about, but we're almost hesitant to actually live our lives based upon them?
That's an interesting question. I've thought about that. I think I have nothing to back this up, but I think it's because teachers and storytellers tend to be ahead of their time, right? And they will often become teachers and storytellers because they think, well, I can't do anything to shape the world around me right now, but I can influence the next generation. And so, unfortunately, that makes the next generation. That means they'll grow up with ideals that are disconnected from the world currently as it is. So they suffer a kind of psychic shock. And I think you see that most with millennials. So people from my age, like we were raised, like we went to school with certain beliefs about how the world ought to be. And then it just wasn't that even remotely when we kind of came of age. And now that's the reason why we're all quite depressed as a generation. But I think that we're also a transitionary generation, right? That's why you're seeing millennials are the ones starting to make the shift towards more collectivist thinking, right? Because they were like, well, okay, we went through this process when we were young, we're like, well, this is the world as it should be. Then we went, okay, well, this world isn't that. So I'm living in this disconnect and I'm depressed now. And then finally, there's a coming together, which I think a lot of millennials are now starting to come to, which is, well, if I want the world that I was brought up to believe is right, and I know is right, then I've got to fight for it, right? And I think what's really heartening for a lot of millennials is, and this is a bit of a tangent, is that a lot of the stuff that we were raised with is just obvious to Zoomers, right? And Zoomers are just going at it. They were like, what the fuck is wrong with the world? Like, let's fight. And they're not even hesitating. And and it's interesting, like, for example, earlier, like, I know you were talking about like the embrace of the word socialism, right? I know a lot of millennials who are bona fide leftists, right? Who are scared of the word because, we were raised in the Cold War, right? Oh, the Cold War. And we also, we're probably a little closer to older generations, right? So we know, so we're, even though you look at our policy positions, our values, 100% alignment, but we're still terrified of that word, right? So I think that, so I feel like I've gotten away from your question a little bit. Remind me, what were you saying? What was the question again?
Oh, just how to connect the values we're taught as kids that are along with what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay, and I think that's just about power, right? Because when we taught those things, then we see other people acting on it, then we have the confidence to actually act on it, right? Because, as I said, like, as I can't tell you how many millennials I know that went through this process of believing that the world should be a certain thing because of how they were taught, then seeing it was not, and then thinking there was something wrong with themselves. Like, so many of them went through it. And then
does that speak to the individual, the way that we're almost taught to engage in our society and the universe in an individual way? Do you think that sort of almost feeling like I must be wrong here, like I must be doing something wrong or viewing the world wrong, does that come from that individual place?
It does. Yeah. And also because, like, the truth is that, there are two sets, there's sets of values at war with each other, right? And one holds power right now, and and as a result of holding power, it has the power to shape how we think, right? And, like, if we think, we've got this emerging set of values that challenges it, well, if you're separated from other people, then you think, well, no, I must be the problem. And that's how a system of value exerts control, right? Is by making you think you're the problem, you've got to change, right? And many of them will. Like, many of them have to just to survive, right? That's why I think it's going to get easier, a lot easier, right? Because so many people have embraced collectivist values now, especially younger people. So this is why, like, for me, like, I'm in my mid-30s, right? I've been very inspired by a lot of, like, people in their 20s and younger, right? because they had the courage to put out a lot of the values that I've always believed, that have sometimes in the past been too afraid to say. And I'm saying this as someone who's spent 10, 15 years in politics, right?
Right.
Here's stuff that I've been afraid to say publicly, right? I wouldn't be having this discussion about philosophy with you, because if I, unless I thought that there were enough people that sort of set the stage for it, right? So I'm ultimately very optimistic. I'm extremely optimistic. Right.
Yeah, I agree. I think the younger generations give some hope on these issues where there's less willingness to equivocate on any of this. They're very, very sort of bold in coming forward with these ideas and saying we're going to attack the system as it is currently because it's not good enough. And I think that that's certainly valuable to our movement, and it opens doors for these kinds of conversations. I'm sure I kind of know the answer to your question because we've talked a number of times about sort of changing how we look at our role in politics and in our society, and empowering ourselves with our mentality. So I have a feeling that has a lot to do with the answer to what I'm going to ask here, and you've already touched on some of this, but what can my audience and myself do to work towards the kind of community building that you're talking about here? That's kind of, I think, a very specific form of community building where we're building around an ideal. How do you think that we can all individually work towards this this goal?
Sure. Well, I don't know if it's maybe we shouldn't be thinking about it as welcoming individually, because that's in a sense.
Really poor word choice on my part there. Yes, yeah. But take the word individual out of it.
We all do have, like, and I'm not coming like with individual, because we all will have specific roles to play. Like, we have different strengths and weaknesses as people. So, like, the goal isn't to kill individuals. That, like, some people are artists, some people are lawyers, whatever, right? That's important. But I think that the first and most important step, I believe, is to ask ourselves, what is the ideal world we want to create? Like, what does our ideal world look like? And that's a surprisingly hard question. And the reason it's hard is because I think that we have understandably and correctly been immersed in a rage against the system itself for so long that that's just what defines us now, like what's fucked about the world as it is. But we need to move beyond that world, right?
Yeah.
I'm saying if you think about it, like, all that anger can lead to in the end, if that's all we ever have, is just, like, at best, a slightly less shit version of the current world order. Because that's you know what I mean? Because they're still dominating. They've just made compromises for you because you're angry, right? And that's not good enough, right? So because their values are still dominating. So we need to say, well, what is our ideal? What is our vision? What does perfection look like for us? What is our utopia? I think we shouldn't be afraid to dream. We shouldn't be afraid to, in fact, no, it's not just we should, but we have to dream, right? And we have to be willing to have discussions, say, well, this is what the world ought to look like. And yeah, maybe it means we get to go back to what we were talking about as kids. Maybe we have to awaken our inner child again, right? And be hopeful.
Yeah, that's another, to draw it back to the kid thing. Like, we were all taught growing up, or at least a lot of the people I was growing up with were taught, like, you can be anything you want. You just work hard. You can be anything. And then it's like, oh, but you can't be that. You can't be that. You know what I mean? Like, so what if what we want is this better society, and a society that embraces better values? We should be able to fight for that, right? Instead of constantly being told no by the powers that be. And I think, I'm a total sports nerd, so I use a sports analogy here, but there's kind of two different ways to approach a game in any given sport. Your team has its strengths, and you can just say, we're going to play to our strengths, and we're going to dominate the game. We're going to take over what type of game this is. Or you can say, we're going to play to our opponent's weakness and try to kind of play defense. And I think what you're saying is our mentality needs to be to play to our strengths, and to kind of take over the narrative and take over the game itself. And you know what I mean? Say, no, we're in the driver's seat now, and here's our ideals, and we're going to get some people on board with this.
Absolutely. Yep. That's it. And the beauty of the funny, like, it's the world is open to it right now, right? Because you've got all these conflicting value sets. Clearly the status quo is unacceptable. That's why the world is in chaos. But nobody, but who's presenting an alternative? Like the MAGA people? Like that's clearly not an acceptable alternative, right? Right-wing nationalism all over the world is trying to present an alternative and failing miserably. But they've also managed to present themselves as the most organized resistance right now, right? So we have to go a step beyond, right? And we have to present our vision of the future and take control of the conversation, right? And I think that the beauty of an establishment which tries to be moderate and compromising and whatever is that the more power you build, right, the more they bend in your direction, right?
Yeah.
So they kind of and that's why it's we keep organizing, we keep building power, and if they want to be all moderate and whatnot, then that means that we just keep moving the discussion in our direction by building more power, right?
How do you think how do you think these ideals might affect people's own interpretation of their political position? Like, do you think someone might actually alter their view of their own ideology as they start to realize what a community can be and how it might actually impact their lives and their loved ones? Could someone that's moderate actually start engaging in politics from a different perspective because of this stuff? Like, could we move political needles as well?
Yeah. I mean, look, let's think, well, what is moderation at its heart? Like, moderation is saying, well, my reality is defined by these two extremes. I'm going to hedge my bets, right? Like, I'm going to think, well, there's got to be something valid in each of them because they both exist. So, and I haven't really made up my own mind, because, I haven't got necessarily my own clear foundations. So let's just kind of respect both of them and hedge my bets. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas that's another reason why we have to engage on these core assumptions about reality, right? Because moderates don't have them, right? That's the truth, right? They just don't have them. So that's why they're allowing themselves to be pulled in multiple directions by other people who do have them, right? So the way you pull over a moderate is by saying, well, hang on, actually, no. These assumptions, do these make sense to you? These are relationships with reality. And if you persuade them on that level, they go, hey, yes, okay, well, good. Then do these political and economic systems that flow from those beliefs not also make sense? Yes. So that's how I think we win people over, right?
I think you're right. I think a lot of moderates are really just hollow husks, and they get filled up with usually the DC establishment, but kind of filled up with whatever they're presented with. So that's where it becomes a game of power, right? And if we have more of an influence over the narratives, we might actually be able to fill them up with some of our ideals and some of our beliefs. Well, Vinay, thank you so much for taking the time today. Was there anything else you wanted to add to this conversation? I want to make sure I didn't miss any particular points or questions here.
Oh, there was something that was just on my mind a moment ago. I'll just see if it comes back to me.
I hate it when that happens. It happens to me all the time.
Yeah. It was. No, it's gone. It's all right.
It's gone. Well, hey, you're going to be back on very shortly, so we'll at some point carry this discussion forward. I really want to thank you for taking the time and for always kind of expanding how we look at our own role in these things. I think it's so important that we have these conversations that I am guilty of neglecting a lot, because there's just so much in the news that, hey, this shitty company did this, and you know what I mean, Biden did that, and we do need to keep the big picture in mind and what we're actually working towards. So I really want to thank you for elevating that conversation and for taking the time to be here today.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk soon, Vinay, and have a good rest of your evening. By the way, on a total side note here, is it totally crazy in Atlanta? Because it's hotter than shit in Seattle.
It's pretty hot here. Yeah. I just came from Vermont winter, so this is kind of a little
bit of a contrast.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, good old global warming, right?
Yeah.
All right, Vinay, we will talk soon. Thank you so much.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, guys. So I had a couple of more things that I wanted to talk about before I show you my interview with Irami. So First, I wanted to go over a little bit about the New York mayor race. So it looks pretty clear that Eric Adams is going to win, although Maya Wiley does have an outside chance with the ranked choice voting. It's a very outside chance. It looks pretty clear that Eric Adams will win the Democratic nomination once ranked choice voting comes through. And Adams, unfortunately, not a very good candidate. He's an ex-police captain. He has close ties to big real estate in New York. He's quite establishment friendly and will not exactly be a bold progressive. But I again want to point out, as I was pointing out extensively with Joe Biden earlier, that Adams is portrayed as some sort of working class hero, or, they'll use terms that make it seem like he's bold and progressive, and he is not. I was very vocally opposed to Andrew Yang's candidacy in terms of his embracing certain policies I have firm disagreements with, and some of his statements about Israel-Palestine and the mentally ill population, etc. But Eric Adams is not, in my opinion, any better. So, and just to be clear, you guys, Maya Wiley was like the last progressive left, and she outperformed what she was supposed to do. But even she is not exactly a progressive. I mean, she was on MSNBC all through the primary season criticizing Bernie endlessly. So, like, the notion that she is even some sort of lefty is not exactly accurate. There were a handful of candidates that were considered sort of the progressive bloc in this race, and none of them were particularly bold progressives. So that's unfortunate in and of itself, that while the rest of New York State is seeing a progressive pivot, a genuine progressive pivot, and I know we tend to get really pessimistic about electoral politics, and I'm including myself in that statement. I get pessimistic about this stuff. But New York State right now, we covered earlier that Buffalo elected an outright socialist, like an openly socialist mayor. And other areas in New York State are genuinely pivoting, even electorally, towards the left. Unfortunately, New York City is not. And New York City, very machine-oriented kind of place. You know, you put your dues in and that kind of thing, and you have connections with all the big political machine people and all that stuff. But I again want to point out that India Walton broke through some of that in Buffalo. Andrew Cuomo had endorsed, I just can't remember the guy's name to save my life. His last name is Brown. I just can't remember his first name, but he was the incumbent mayor, is the incumbent mayor. And even Cuomo's power could not, fend off India Walton's campaign. So it's unfortunate that because New York City gets so much attention, there are people who argue, you guys, that New York City mayor is the hardest job in American politics. And I don't think that's that inaccurate. I think it's right up there. So it gets a lot of attention, and it would have been huge if we could have gotten a genuine leftist to be even competitive for this particular seat. And we're just not seeing that, you guys. I do hope that Maya Wiley wins, but I'm not exactly enthusiastic about her campaign, as I said. I'm not enthusiastic about Eric Adams either. And we'll have to see what happens with ranked choice voting. But this is for the left. I think it's just overall an unfortunate situation that we did not have any candidates that really were espousing a leftist platform in the city of New York, which is known as a progressive haven of sorts, right? And another story here that is about Joe Biden. I have an article here in Truth Out. Biden urges cities to use COVID funds to hire more police. Racial justice advocates say President Biden's new plan for addressing crime and gun violence would encourage cities to divert pandemic relief funding away from communities and into the police departments that terrorize them. Moreover, they say the plan does little to reverse decades of racist policies that both target and abandon Black, Indigenous, and people of color, making their communities more vulnerable to violence. As activists around the country call for a defunding of police, the White House announced Wednesday it will allow cities to pull from $350 billion in federal pandemic relief funds to both hire more police and increase resources for community-based violence prevention programs. Critics say that building up police departments won't stop a spike in gun violence that some cities experienced as the pandemic put unprecedented pressure on communities that were already economically vulnerable. Instead, they say increasing police will further endanger marginalized communities, and those activists are exactly correct. We know what role police play, you guys. They're oppressive, they're violent, they instigate situations, they escalate situations. They are not there to serve society. At least that is not their role, as it stands. So that Joe Biden will rhetorically stand by Black Lives Matter. He will rhetorically oppose police brutality. He will make a big deal out of Derek Chauvin's sentence. He will, give compassionate words to the families of Black men killed by police and all these things. He then will turn around and do the exact opposite of what these communities want. How belittling, how condescending, how patronizing. It's gross. And if Donald Trump did that, he would be rightly eviscerated, and Joe Biden will not be. He'll be celebrated. So for lip service, for cheap lip service. Talk is cheap, especially in politics. So we're headed in the wrong direction on police brutality and law enforcement issues as a whole, which obviously one of the core issues right now in the country, you guys. I mean, there's a handful of issues that are really, really prevalent right now. But police brutality, after what's happened in the last year and a half or so, is right up near the top of that list. And I am discouraged to see that the election of Joe Biden seems to have quieted many voices on this particular issue. A lot of loud voices are still going, and I congratulate them and commend them. But there does seem to have been a temperature drop on this particular issue when Joe Biden took office. And I think some of it has to do with that cheap talk, with the rhetorical, symbolic, political theater that Biden is willing to engage in, while he refuses steadfastly to back up any of that theater with action or with substance. So shame on Joe Biden yet again. Joe Biden, and I just want to remind everybody, when he tries to portray himself as an ally of the Black community, Joe Biden once said he didn't want his kids growing up in a racial jungle. Joe Biden said in 2008 that Barack Obama was the first mainstream African-American who's articulate and bright and clean. Joe Biden has never met a drug war he didn't support or like himself write. Like when he was in the House and Senate, he was writing a lot of these bills and pushing a lot of these bills. Obviously, the 94 crime bill gets a lot of attention, as it should. Joe Biden has, on his foreign policy, a lot of the innocent civilians that we murder around the world are Black and brown communities. Joe Biden has, again, been very aggressive on foreign policy on these issues. Joe Biden embraces the economic structure that has screwed over marginalized communities, including the Black and Indigenous community. Joe Biden, known for the bankruptcy bill, he and Elizabeth Warren actually really went at it in the mid-2000s over this particular issue. And Biden ends up taking a position that disallows again, disproportionately Black community from pulling out of debt. So apologies for my camera app, you guys. It always comes back in just a second. But it's just unfortunate that Joe Biden is going to get away with being praised for rhetoric and for theater, while he refuses to embrace any of the policy reforms that would actually improve people's lives. The most desperate and marginalized people in our country are getting nothing but lip service from this president, and that's disgusting. And that he portrays himself as someone who would fight for these communities is all the more disgusting. So shame on Joe Biden in a myriad of different ways. I want to also highlight that this is what won Joe Biden the primary. Jim Clyburn in South Carolina endorsed Biden, but didn't just endorse Biden, did so on the grounds that he was some sort of hero for the Black community. And that had a lot to do with why Joe Biden dominated South Carolina, which was the thing that was the state that propelled him into Super Tuesday. Moderates consolidated behind him, all of the shit that you guys know about, and he becomes president. So I think it is not entirely unlikely that Bernie Sanders might be president right now if Jim Clyburn had not made such a firm endorsement, a strong endorsement. And for him to base that endorsement on an issue where Joe Biden has not just been like not good, but has been one of the worst politicians in modern history, I find to be particularly disgusting and egregious and hypocritical. And Jim Clyburn was a hero on this issue. I mean, he marched with Dr. King, and he was a civil rights icon. Unfortunately, over the decades, he then became an establishment Democrat, and his support for Biden did a lot to put him in the White House today. So, just major condemnation on the Democratic establishment and Joe Biden for the way that they've conducted themselves on this issue, portraying themselves as heroes for marginalized communities while they continue to step on them. It's outrageous. I have a very fantastic segment here for you guys coming up next. This is a long segment, but it's pre-recorded. Irami Osei-Frimpong is better known as the Funky Academic. He's a doctoral student at the University of Georgia. He also does a YouTube show, which I posted in the description box. He is a fantastic thinker. He's always making me kind of expand the way that I look at a lot of these ideas. I had him on to discuss critical race theory. This is an absolutely fantastic segment. I'm excited to bring you guys this. And when we finish this segment, I'll come back and close the show out. So I'm very happy to have back on the show today Irami Osei-Frimpong. Irami is better known as the Funky Academic. He is a doctoral student at the University of Georgia and is somewhat of a political commentator. He does guest appearances on media outlets as well as hosting his own YouTube channel, The Funky Academic, which I'll post in the description box. Irami, thanks for taking the time to be here.
No problem. Thanks for having me. This is going to be fun. Good.
Yeah, this is, I think, a very critical topic that seems to have kind of erupted into a bit of a culture war. So I'm very excited to get your take on it. You've had a few fantastic videos lately about critical race theory, and I was hoping you could start just by kind of drawing the comparison to critical legal theory. You talk about formalism and what that means when we're talking about these kind of macro social issues. Can you just kind of explain those parallels?
So critical race theory is actually, it emerged out of critical legal theory with the understanding that the story we tell ourselves about the judiciary isn't actually how courts work, right? So the story we tell ourselves about the judiciary is that all courts do is apply a law to an instance, regardless of the law or the instance, and how that's how just, and that's just, right? We don't take social factors into account. We don't take political factors into account. The idea is that stealing is taking someone else's property. So if Rebecca takes someone else's property, then the court will say that Rebecca stole, regardless of Rebecca's reputation as a huge philanthropist who gives money to all of these worthy organizations that keep society running and humming and gives money to political candidates. And if somehow a court decided that Rebecca stole, she would be soured about all giving in the public sphere and she would refuse to give anywhere. So the story is that no matter what, no matter Rebecca's non-legal political and social affiliations, the court is going to merely apply a law to the rule. But Oliver Wendell Holmes and all of these other actual legal realists in the late 19th century and early 20th century just like said the court doesn't manifestly work that way, right? The court always, and for Holmes, should have like social considerations in mind, so that if Rebecca is like Mackenzie Scott, would just give billions of dollars a year every year and gets charged with stealing a paperclip, and if Rebecca is found guilty of stealing that paperclip, she's of the kind of temperament that would just cease giving, then maybe the court should like not find her guilty because of all of the social upheaval that would make, right? So the idea that the critical legal theorists introduce a quality of realism into the story we tell ourselves about the judiciary. And you have to understand the judiciary is an interesting branch because, and Hamilton says this in Federalist 85, I want to say, that like, look, the courts, they don't have access to the budgets, that's a legislator, and they don't have access to the military. They have neither the power of the purse nor the power of the sword, because the executive has the power to the military and the judiciary has the power of the budget. So they really can't lead change because they depend on all of these other branches to realize their orders, right? So the courts are actually vulnerable to influence of these other branches because we can't, the game can't be given, like the game can't be exposed as the court having no power. So the court's never going to go much farther than the judiciary or the executive is willing to back them because the court can't. Right?
Yeah, and I think we see some fantastic examples lately of this with some Supreme Court findings. We see them essentially capitulating to the corrupt political, establishment, in the sense that they're kind of cornered into finding certain ways because that's how the laws are written, right? So the court in and of itself has to be responsive to institutions that themselves might be corrupted or not being applied in the way that is to the benefit of all of society.
Yeah, the court depends on other institutions to realize their orders, right? And I mean, we saw this with desegregation in the South, right? Brown versus Board of Education goes one way, and the whole South is like, well, that sounds like a you problem. We're going to keep doing it.
Yeah.
So like the court doesn't have access to guns or legislative. Things kind of changed when there was a budget. I think it's the ESEA, the Education and Secondary Schooling Act in the 60s, tied money to desegregation, right? So without that tying money to desegregation, like the South just said like, no, we're going to keep doing what we do. Good luck.
Yeah, and Lincoln did this too during the Civil War. I mean, he said the Supreme Court has made their finding, let's see them enforce it, right? I mean, exactly. Other institutions can very much just say you're operating within a particular framework. You brought up the Board of Brown v. Board, and I saw you talk a couple times about the actual history there, and this kind of provides a nice parallel for critical race theory too, in the sense that there were so many outside factors that influenced the United States decision on Brown v. Board. Can you talk about like some of the ex-Soviet stuff and these kinds of histories that impacted that decision?
That's great. So what you have to understand about Brown v. Board of Education is that up until 1954, the Supreme Court had a long-standing tradition of allowing states to mandate segregation, right? So what changed? According to the verdict and the cited reasons, it's that we applied the 14th Amendment and saw that the 14th Amendment can't be upheld in schools that segregate. The thing is, you're forcing desegregation, so you could make another legal argument that's saying you're forcing people to associate with people that they don't want to associate with, right? So if we're just going to make legal arguments in the abstract, you can make a very good legal argument that like desegregation is forced association, which is unconstitutional, right? So it's not like the constitutional argument for desegregation is indeterminate. It could go either way. It's fundamentally underdeveloped or underdetermined. It could go either way. You can find any precedent you want to support the verdict you want, right? And you can look at any fact and you can say that, well, courts just look at facts and apply laws to facts. But depends on which fact you're looking at. Are you looking at the fact of forced association, or you looked at the fact of unequal distribution of resources? So you can pick which fact is the relevant one. Right. So the court has all of this discretion. And so what really accounts for the change in mood of the court? Well, Derek Bell, one of the founders and seminal influence of critical race theory, he argues that, like, look, you have to look at the time in 1954. 1954 is an interesting time in America and a changing time in America for a few different reasons. One, you have the Cold War, right? So the United States is persecuting a Cold War, against Russia. And in order to do that, there are a lot of proxy wars fighting in the developing world, right? So we need to win hearts and minds in the developing world in order to fight these proxy wars against Russia. The problem is the rhetoric that the United States would use in the developing world couldn't match the internal dynamic of the United States, right? So Russia made pretty much a slogan out of, don't listen to the Americans, they still lynch Negroes. Right, they lynch Negroes. And it's great because there's a Polish version of it, there's an Estonian version of it, and you lynch Negroes. Apparently, someone in the Philippines, I'm going to see if I can find you could just Wikipedia and you're still lynching Negroes, and the whole story will come up. Apparently someone in the Philippines just said that to a US diplomat. You guys are still lynching Negroes over there too, right? So and then foreign diplomats and dignitaries would come to the US and be treated like trash in the South, and then that would get reported into the foreign press that the U.S. isn't really a great place and it's not really the land of the free because, one, they still lynch Negroes and they treated our dignitary like crap. So it was actually it was causing problems for our international aspirations. The fact that we made like law out of degrading an entire people, right? So, and then there are CIA memos and briefs written to the Department of Justice that are then submitted to the Warren Court, like kind of like about how like this is a problem, right? This is a problem for us persecuting the Cold War. So anti-communism, like is a pretty substantive contribution to the moment of the civil rights, to the effectiveness of the civil rights movement. So yeah, a lot of white interests that had an interest in getting rid of state-sponsored degradation, because
so this is a perfect. This is an example of how the court isn't just going on like the formal legal precedent, right? There's all these other influences that are coming in, right? And this ties into how we evaluate race in society.
Right. So there are all of these other non-judicial institutions that have a big interest in the verdict. Now, critical race theory is saying like, actually, it's not just that. The Supreme Court's vulnerable. So these non-judicial interests actually cause or contribute to this change in the verdict, right? So one is anti-communism. If we're gonna actually get serious about anti-communism, we gotta get this stuff off the books. We gotta actually like wipe the stain. It's distasteful. It's making us look bad. It's hard, right? So the other thing is having like so many Black World War II veterans who went and like killed a bunch of white people in Europe for America, and then come back to America and are getting treated like trash in America, and they all have guns, and it's just like the unrest becomes like a matter of domestic tranquility, and then
no
it
longer
like
sustainable, right? We can't deal with this anymore. Like we actually now have a situation where we have to react to this group of people that we've oppressed over hundreds of years.
Yeah, and now like armed, and now we know how to arm. Like we saw this a little bit with the bonus army in World War I, right? When like all of the white veterans came back and wanted their cut, right? I think that was World War I. The bonus, and they camped out on the lawn and all of that. I'm pretty sure, I'll double check, but I'm pretty sure that's World War I. So like having veterans, like not doing well by veterans causes political problems, right? So not doing well by Black veterans was causing all of these race and political problems, and they were left out of the GI Bill. So like it was just all of these kind of state-sponsored degradations of Black people when it mattered. Like we're starting to bleed into state-sponsored degradations of veterans, and that was becoming an issue, right?
Do you think that's, just very quickly, do you think that that's where the sort of the patriotism tendency ran up against the racist tendency? Like, do you think that clash actually changed individual minds on this issue?
Yeah, it definitely did. Well, it caused problems because you had like people who legitimately fought in World War II for freedom, or at least was supposed to have fought for freedom, come home and be like, have to be on the bottom side of apartheid. Right. So like the contradiction was starting to become untenable. And like I said, domestic tranquility was at stake. So the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves have a lot to do with how we sustain our domestic tranquility. And media is starting to become a little bit more like prolific, so you can't hide these contradictions as easily. So that becomes an issue. That's number two. So anti-communism, the Soviets like looking at Black people like, woo.
Yeah, come on over here. We're not going to lynch you, right? I mean,
yeah, like yeah, exactly. The Soviets telling Black people your country's run by hypocrites, and Black people being like, yeah, our country's run by hypocrites and violent hypocrites, and you don't like that. So so you got the anti-communism, you got Black veterans, and thirdly, you have to understand that it wasn't too long ago that the American South was pretty much a plantation economy that like didn't really have a path forward for economic development. Like, you know, the new films out of Atlanta and all of that stuff, that's not really that old. Like, before the Olympics, Atlanta was just another rural town. Well, slightly bigger than a rural town, but like not a lot bigger than a rural town. So a rural city. So you had a lot of white business elites who saw, you know, state-sponsored pretty much apartheid actually frustrating and becoming an obstacle to to the economic growth of the entire region.
And was
Right.
was that a social dynamic in the same sense that, like, when we see an anti-voting law or something, the NBA might move their all-star game, or like these kinds of, was that sort of a social pressure?
That's exactly what was going on, right? So like anyone who's like any company that might be seen to be involved with the January 6th, treason parade, that like needs to kind of distance itself from those guys, right? Or anyone who could be somewhat affiliated with Charlottesville needs to distance them, the Tiki Torch folks over in Charlottesville. Like it becomes a problem, right, for the development. Like the Panhellenics and all the Greek societies had to come out with like a woke anti-racist campaign to like distance themselves from the Tiki Torch people in Charlottesville, right? And like Facebook and Twitter had to ban Donald Trump and come out with like statements about how they weren't the infrastructure through which the protesters organized, even if
they hadn't facilitated this. Yeah, exactly.
Right, like,
they had to run from it. Not us. Yeah,
because it'd be bad for business, right? So there's a way in which racism is bad for business, in the same way that it's bad for like the Cold War, and it was distasteful in such a way, right? So when racism became so distasteful for economic elites that they couldn't make money out of the South or transition the South to like a better economy or a more modern economy, then there's another external non-judiciary interest in having the court come out on the side it did for Brown versus Board of Education. So Derek Bell like writes a series of articles saying that like, look, you don't really understand the Brown verdict unless you understand anti-communism in the Cold War, unless you understand the need for domestic tranquility for to deal with these Black veterans and the problems that state-sponsored racism was causing for economic development in the South. And all of those three interests I listed were really white interests, right?
Right.
So in order to understand the Brown versus Board of Education verdict, you need to understand the convergence of these white interests and the influence that these institutions have on a very vulnerable court that can't actually realize any of its aspirations without the complicity of these other institutions, right? So if you think you understand the Brown versus Board of Education verdict just by looking at the 14th Amendment, you have an abstract and confused understanding of like the real workings of the verdict. Right.
Yeah,
so,
and I think there's also, I would tie this to some modern cases too with Roberts apparently, and this is all behind the scenes reporting, but he is apparently very concerned with maintaining the legitimacy or the air of legitimacy of the Supreme Court right now because of how Republicans obstructed over the last few years, right? That is in and of itself an external pressure on his findings, right? And you actually see this where the conservatives will try to throw one or two votes another way to make it look a little bit like, that's very directly an external pressure on the judicial system. That's not just the formal precedent coming out, right?
Right. Like Roberts has a PR problem because he has to kind of manage the court in a way that makes it look like the court has more functional power than it does. Once people realize that the court like can't enforce its own orders without the legislative or executive approval, then the rule of law becomes a little bit dicey, right? The rule of law becomes like people just start ignoring judges. You know what? People, we have a problem right now with people ignoring warrants and not showing up to court. What happens when people just ignore entire judgments because they're not enforced? They're not popular enough to be enforced by the legislator or the executive. So Warren Robert's job is to keep the courts out of the news, or insofar as they're in the news, it's in a case that happens to be aligned with the budgetary priorities and the executive will, so that like whatever the court orders will actually be realized and enforced. Because Roberts can't have the court issuing orders that are just flouted by standing legislatures, that are unfunded mandates that are unfunded by standing legislatures or unenforced by executive guns.
And even
Right,
though it's
so-
a different type of dynamic, that parallels very nicely with the United States needing certain positions during the Cold War, right? This is no longer sustainable for us in a geopolitical sense. So we have to adjust our position, right?
Our internal politics in order to account for like our international aspirations.
Right.
So just understanding like the political usefulness of judicial verdicts is a part of what it is to understand the verdict itself, right? And if you try to understand the verdict without understanding how it functions in these social and political institutions, then you don't really understand the verdict. You're confused about like, how the verdict came to be what it was.
Yeah.
And you're confused about what it's going to take to change the verdict. Right?
Yes,
So,
or the dynamic that created it, which is really the more underlying, yes. And people actually do admit this in a weird way, where we act as though the law is this very sort of unmalleable thing, right? But then we also very much admit when it comes to like replacing one of the 9 Supreme Court justices, just how important that is. Everyone freaks out, right? Well, if the law is just this sort of unmalleable thing, then who cares who's interpreting it?
Yeah,
yes,
I should be able to write an app that just kind of like calls balls and strikes.
Yeah. Like you and I and Donald Trump and Bill Clinton should all interpret it all the exact same way if that's how the law is, right? But that's not how it is at all.
That's not how it is. So in the two different spheres where this works, right? So even if the court's just finding facts, there are a lot of facts, right? So like picking which fact is the relevant fact is a matter of discretion, and it's going to come up to like your opinions about things, right?
Right,
So,
or which precedent to prioritize. If I have 3 different facts that speak to 3 different legal precedents, I might have to pick one to like, it becomes very, very subjective in many ways.
And precedents aren't some like preternatural harmonious like body of like statutes, right? So like you have precedents that contradict each other, so I have to pick which precedent I like, and they're both precedent. Right?
Yeah.
So
they
like,
also might both hold a lot of weight. They might be very important, but I have to prioritize. It doesn't. That's yeah.
So, and that's going to come down to your political values and all of your other judgments, right? Or going to be like influenced by like, well, I'm going to pick the precedent that's actually going to be supported by the legislature and the executive branch, so that like whatever we order is actually realized. And so like we're not just 9 people talking to ourselves.
Yeah. So to tie this back in, then you had another metaphor that I thought was fantastic, and I think it kind of applies here. You're talking about all these outside influences on this particular decision, Brown v. Board, and this applies to any decision that has impacted the race dynamic in the country. Right. You had this chess analysis where if you're zoomed in enough on the chessboard, it might look one way, right? You're only seeing maybe 5 or 6 pieces or whatever, and you might think, oh, it's even, or one side's dominating or whatever. You zoom out and you could get a totally different context. The queen's sitting there ready to take your best piece or whatever it might be, right? So can you talk a little bit about how critical race theory is actually just expanding our view on how race interacts with society and adding to the conversation and, you know, providing additional substance?
I might be even be able to do more than that even. So you give me a second.
No problem.
How long have you been doing this podcast?
So I'm with Real Progress in Action right now, Real Progressives, and that's relatively new. I've been doing that for about a month. I've been doing media since last summer.
Okay. Well, you know, you're providing a really nice service by getting these arguments out to people.
I appreciate that, Irami, and you too. And by the way, let me just say for my audience, I meant to say this when I introduced you. It's at Irami OF on Twitter and funkyacademic.com if you want to learn more about Irami's work or contribute to his work.
All right. So I think I'm pretty much set. Right. So if I just ask people if like they know how a night moves, they'll be like, yeah, I know how a night moves. I know everything I need to know. I know everything I need to know about a night moves. It's not complicated. I know in the abstract how nights move. And then you say, do you know how this night moves? They'll be like, yeah, I know how this night moves. But then what happens if the chessboard is blown out and you have that same night? I think I might have added that same night now, you get this situation, right? Right. So that's in situation. And then you can ask yourself the question, do you know how a night moves? And the answer is both like yes and no, right? So before I would have said like some abstract answer that's decontextualized. Yeah, a night can go, two spaces in one space, and two spaces in one direction, and then one space over. But now when I put like in context, it looks like one, the night actually can't move that way backwards because the black pawns are in the way. Like it actually can't move the way that story told me it could. And then if I move the knight in a way that it can move, like it gets killed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it can't move and stay alive. The presupposition would be like, do I know how a knight can move and stay alive? So the knight can't move down and over because it runs into those pawns. And the knight can't move over in any way because it would get killed by the other white pieces, right? So the real story is this knight's stuck, but you don't know the knight's stuck if you ask this person, can the knight move? Right? So the knight doesn't look stuck if you just think of it as a self-subsisting thing in the abstract. But once you actually understand how knights function in a game, you understand that this knight's screwed.
Yeah.
This knight's screwed.
I think it's like to not implement critical race theory as we evaluate this stuff would almost be to treat someone who's born into being a well-positioned queen the same as someone who's a poor positioned pawn. You just without context, it would be maybe easy to make that comparison because they all deal with the same legal standards and it's all right, same society, whatever. But if you're not taking the context into account, you're doing an incredibly poor analysis of the situation. Right, and you don't understand the vulnerability of the institutions involved, right? So there's one more chess little analogy that I have queued up here that I think is actually pretty lovely. Let me just click that, click that, click that. All right, so this situation is kind of not this situation isn't the best situation for black. Right? This situation isn't the best situation for black. I mean, a really canny chess player can kind of wrestle a victory or a draw out of this if the black is very good and white's very bad. But like just in terms of position, you're at a structural disadvantage. And if people tell you that this is this is the state of play in race in America, you'd be like, well, blacks are at a disadvantage, but like it's not fatal. It's not that bad. The thing is, once again, if you blow up the board, it turns out that your abstract understanding of the same board is missing a lot of context.
It's missing a lot of pieces, right? This is like all I did was blow it up. It's the same pieces. All I did is blow up and show you more of the game, right? I didn't change really the parts of the game that you knew, that you saw. I just showed you more of it in a way that fundamentally changes the whole game, right? Actually, this is the one I usually use, right? So I just showed you more of the game, right?
For those that the very middle of that board is the exact same thing you were just looking at, but all of a sudden it's a situation that Bobby Fischer couldn't get out of. Like you're screwed.
This isn't just slight disadvantage or like I can just hustle my way out. This is like we need to like throw this game over. You can't play. Like if you're playing, you're being irresponsible. Like the first situation will be like, well, if I'll take, and I said this on the show, the first situation is if someone gave me $10,000 to play black and I had to pay $200 if I lose, I'd be like, well, I don't know. It might be maybe worth
it, right? Might be if they make one mistake, maybe I can. Yeah.
Right. It might be worth it. $10,000 to win and only $200 if I lose. I might take it. Like it's not. I could win something out. But then if someone blows up the same situation, hold on. Yeah, and shows me this. Then it's like, no, I don't want to waste $200. Like it'd be throwing $200 away.
Yep. Yep.
Right. So critical race theory just shows you all of the aspects, all the institutional pressures that are abstracted when you just take the narrow view.
Yeah.
Right. So all of the institutional pressures that are abstracted when you just take the narrow view actually change the game. Right. So my relationship to things that aren't me actually changes who I am. And that's what's scary for a lot of liberals and in a different way for conservatives, right? So the idea is that what I am as a knight shouldn't change based on other things. But it turns out what I am changes based on its relationship to things that aren't me.
Yeah.
Right. So if I marry a woman who I'm in love with, that's great. If it turns out and she's adopted, and I don't know if I told this on the story, but I was thinking about this on a run. Like if I marry a woman I'm in love with, and that's great. That's great. It turns out she's adopted. She doesn't know who her parents are. That's fine. We make it together and it's great. And then it turns out that she's the long lost adopted daughter. She's the long lost daughter of Mackenzie Scott,
Mm-hmm.
Jeff Bezos' ex-wife.
You're now a billionaire.
I am now have a joint account with the heir of someone worth $1 billion. I have changed.
Yeah.
I didn't do anything.
Right. Right.
Except wake up. Except my relationship to and my wife didn't do anything, but
right.
Mackenzie Scott got a DNA test or decides to claim this daughter for some reason. And now I have changed. Yeah. And any story you tell yourself about how you haven't changed because you are now married to an heiress is just not true. Is all the things you can do in the world and how you can realize yourself in the world have fundamentally changed, not because of anything you've done, but because of what you're now related to.
Right. Not just the things you're interacting with or your experiences have changed.
Right.
Your qualities, your properties have actually been altered. Like you are, yes.
You are a different kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my aspirations for my life, everything that's meaningful in my life has now has a different valence now. I can be a different kind of friend. I can be a different kind of media entrepreneur. Everything I can it's different. I can now fund a whole universe. I could be a different, I am different.
Yes.
My properties are different. What my aspirations are different. And
your access to doing things in your life that you want. Things have now opened up that you did not previously have social access to, right? We think we're all free, but if you don't have the financial freedom to do something, you're really not free. Really not free.
So
it's like Bernie said, I think, how did he put it? He said, I have access to a private jet. Any guesses why I don't have one? We all have access to that. That's right. Access doesn't mean, yeah.
Yeah, you can realize yourself through it, right? So the idea that critical race theory introduces is that all of these formal methods that we have for evaluating events actually confuse us about the real emergence of these events, right? So it's a realist intervention against formalism. And real quickly, I want to take some of your audience members back to, you remember that time prior to the crash around 2007? You were a babe, just a young man. But I remember the time because I was an adult. And at the time, people were talking about Freakonomics had just coming out, and Stephen Levitt was saying you can understand the world through formal economics. And Bill Gates was about to take over every political institution, because who needs politics when we have business people involved? Because business people know everything. We just need to apply analytics to the problem, and we can write an algorithm to figure it out. And then
Yeah.
2008 happens, and we realize, one, the economists aren't really that good at even understanding the economy. Forget understanding everything else. Right? And then a few of Bill Gates's like philanthropic ventures fall flat, especially in education. And we understand that like business people aren't even aren't very good at politics because they don't even understand like, you know, people and how these things work and all the institutional pressures. So we had these formal models prior to 2008 that were supposed to explain the world. And then the market crashed, and like a lot of people realized that a lot of these quantitative models, because formal models are going to skew towards quantitative because the idea is that one of anything is the same.
Mm-hmm.
So like it's going to,
which is absurd, but yes.
Right. So regardless of interactions, like that's the same as like every night is the same as a night, regardless of its interaction with all the other pieces on the board.
The
like,
night surrounded by queens is the same as the night that's it's absurd. Yes.
That's holding a checkmate. They're all worth 3 points according to chess people. So like actually that's not quite, it's a rule of thumb that actually distorts the functioning of like the pieces in the game, right? So the economists with their formal methods weren't even very good at understanding economy. And Bill Gates, with like all of his technical knowledge and his apps, wasn't even actually like, you know, they couldn't solve political problems, right? So the first real critical intervention like that we lived through, I think, was the 2008 crisis, when we realized like we have to understand, we were about to give everything to the economists. All social sciences were just going to be a variety of economics. Like all like everything, the economists were about to take over, and then they just unmasked themselves, or the economy actually unmasked them at fraud, at the one thing they were actually supposed to be able to do. And then we kind of pulled back their influence on all of the other. Instead of like just making Larry Summers czar of everything, we had to like rein him in and say that you guys should like be a little bit more humble, and we need to actually think of these political problems as political. So that's the big intervention of critical race theory, is that showing that these issues where race is the variable can't be abstracted from their context and how they figure in to white institutional interests. Like even if the issue is a Brown v. Board of Education verdict, it can't be abstracted from white institutional interests and racist institutional interests. So for example, the 1619 Project, right? Gerald Horne and all these people like say like, look, you have to understand that there was a lot of anxiety. There were slave rebellions, and you have to understand that like the people in like Gwinnett and all these people in the South, these slave owners in the South, they didn't care about self-government. At the time, the South was just little like petty fiefdoms and plantations. What they wanted was to make sure that their property was secure. And when they meant property, they meant Black people. Right. So the idea that London was getting ready to abolish slavery in the colonies, that was a real fear. That was a real fear because they had already abolished slavery in England proper because of the Somerset verdict. Like that's a real fear. Did it cause the American Revolution? No, not by itself. Did it contribute to it? I mean, yeah, because it's not like.
How could it not have, right?
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, like it's like the way people talk about Trump. Did Trump get elected because of white resentment and racism? I mean, it contributed. The backlash against Obama contributed. Was that everything? No. I mean, a lot of the people who voted for Obama voted for Trump. So but it did contribute to people who thought that like their nation was being taken away, and when they meant their nation, they meant like their white racial hierarchy identity.
They meant that in a white supremacist sense, not in a
Yeah. So like that contributed to it. How much? 10, 15%. Like it doesn't really matter. Was it a contributing factor? Yes. Can you tell a story about Trump's? Can you tell an economically reductive story about Trump's ascendance that doesn't include race? It's not going to be it's not a full
picture, right? We can talk about Hillary not going to Michigan. We can talk about trade. We can talk about all these things, but it's not, without any given piece, it's not really a full context of what happened, right?
You'll have a distorted view of what's going on. And so we need to understand there aren't monological causes to a lot of these historical events. And we need to be okay with that. Like one contributing factor was resentment. Another contributing factor was NAFTA. Another contributing factor was the tapes. Another contributing factor was the fact that Hillary Clinton was like a bad candidate.
Horrible politician, self-admitted horrible politician. Yes.
Yeah. So like maybe like there are lots of contributing factors. And if you get rid of all of the contributing factors, or the fact that like Trump was on TV, like, you know, behind a desk making orders for 10 years, like all of these are contributing factors. And if you get rid of any of them, you don't understand like the event.
So to take that to a nice pivot to what I wanted to get to next, which is kind of the backlash. I want to get your opinion on the sort of the political and cultural backlash. But first, you talked a little bit about how children interpret this and how critical race theory actually takes away a tendency to internalize these issues. And you said, you know, Black kids will actually blame themselves for their own oppression if they're not taught the full context of this. And similarly, white kids might not understand systemic issues that they really should understand if we're actually going to better society, and they may end up internalizing it and taking it as guilt, right? So if
guilt, just taking out like which is better. I mean, it's unfortunate, but like, you know, we just kind of are better at things.
Right. So can you talk about how important it is for, and you also talked, this was, I think, a really critical point, that there's a pretty easy distinction to be made between white parents and white kids and how they interpret this stuff.
Right.
And I think there's a tendency to almost take critical race theory among adults as some sort of claim that like every white person is a raging racist with hate in their heart, right? And that's not, it's actually saying quite the opposite of that. It's saying that these are systemic issues. So can you talk about how important it is to teach this to kids and what that can do?
All right. So I read a nice little anecdote about, like, let's say it's 100 years ago or 50 years, whatever amount of years ago. And there's a hotel owner who is ableist, hates disabled people, doesn't want disabled people in the hotel, think they like make those rich clients uncomfortable. And so he builds a hotel like in a way that disabled people can't even like operate. The stairs are like huge, and like, so like there are no disability accommodations, right? He's a huge ableist, horrible person. So now it's 50 years later. The hotel is the same, but it's been structured so that disabled people can't get in it, right? So, but you know, some people have their memories fondly of growing up running around the hotel, and they don't want the hotel to change, and they feel uncomfortable with like someone going after their childhood because they grew up summering at this hotel, and they just don't want like the big retrofit that would have to happen to make it accommodate disabled. They themselves aren't particularly, they like disabled people. They also like
what they like about the hotel does not have to be the ableist aspect of the hotel. No. They might just have a childhood memory that's nostalgic or whatever, right?
Right. So so the idea is that they're not like they aren't the problem. The person who built and designed the hotel and funded the hotel is a problem. And it's just an accident of history that all of their memories are intertwined with a structure that might have to change a little bit if it's going to be made to accommodate justice, right? So the contemporary people aren't going to have a problem with it because we're not calling them racist.
Right.
Like we're not going to call them, they're not ableist, and like nobody's ever said they're ableist, but we have to deal with this structure.
Right. So the institution needs to be fixed so that it's not at all yet detached from the person, right? Yes.
So who's going to have a problem with it? The problem is going to be with the people who say, like, one, don't call my granddad the one who provided this wonderful house, that provided, like, who willed through his grit the edifice that allowed you to have your memories of an ableist and a racist and a bad person, right? So they're going to be the person who wants to like hold on to the memories of like some like entrepreneur. It's the same stories we tell about Henry Ford, right? Like he wasn't really a Nazi. Although like I'm pretty sure it's Ford, right? Who like it's got really dicey. I think he was like going to sell cars to Hitler. Like, yeah. So like,
luckily for Hitler, he had enough Mercedes over there to
do it, right? So like the idea that we need to keep the memories of these American icons pure does a lot of work, right? And also, people are just scared that you're going to take away, like, you're going to somehow degrade and tarnish their nostalgic childhood, right?
Yeah,
So
that is a really fantastic metaphor, because I think most people who didn't have some sort of attachment to that hotel would see this very clearly,
yeah,
right? You either would have to be like explicitly ableist or have some sort of connection to this hotel to take a position on this that is not the obvious one, right?
like, yeah, let's like put some wheelchair ramps, and like we're gonna have to take out that wall and make a ramp, and like,
Yeah, yeah,
like, so it's not, it's like, so, and it's gonna seem crass when the people who do have an attachment to the edifice like hear that. It's going to seem crass, but like, you know,
right.
kind of a serious person is going to walk in and say like, all right, so like we need to make smaller steps, and we need to build an elevator there and knock out. So like, it's going to seem crass, but it's actually like, it's not that big of a deal to like people who don't have a weird emotional attachment to the structure as is that can't be justified with the demands of justice. And so, so the kids don't really have that weird attachment. Yeah. Like, cause it's not about them, right? Even if their grandfather is the progenitor of the hotel, it's going to be the parents who want to like inculcate into the kids a reverence for, you know, tradition or the structure as is. And they're going to be the ones who are threatened because they don't know how to parent in a just world. They just know, like, they were parented, and they were parented by racists. So like, so they're like threatened by, like, they don't like, so like the anxiety is going to be with the parents. The kids are fine. The kids are, they don't take it personally. They are just thrown into a world that is organized this way, and like actually will be kind of made like enthusiastic and like get a meaningful life. I'm like, all right, so our project is kind of like making this hotel like ableist, like like disabled friendly, accommodating. So, like, that's our work. That's how we get meaning to our life. And if you take away that work from the kids, that's when you get like suburban ennui. That's when like you'll get a lot of drug problems, because like the most obvious work that could get meaning in their life, you're saying that they shouldn't deal with. And
you're suppressing their curiosity. I think that's one of the cruelest things you can do, is suppress a child's curiosity, right? But as we grow up, then we have the preconceived notions start to kind of take over our positions, and
then we
and that might speak to some of that.
Then we start thinking about the inheritance. We start thinking about the inheritance and not taking off Papa anymore. And so like all of these other institutional
Grandpa's hotel makes millions of dollars. That's going to put me in a nice house in 10 years. So I think I'm going to maybe change my opinion about Grandpa's hotel, right?
And like he retrofitted it to fit elite interests. And elite interests don't want like ramps. They want like someone to carry them. So like so it starts like all of these other interests start mucking up the struggle for justice. But,
so do you think that like, is that do people do you think explicitly hearing when we teach a macro kind of social concept like this, are people explicitly hearing you're calling me racist? Or do you think people are so bought into the kind of meritocratic view of the world that they basically think you're telling them, well, you had it easy, and they can't hear that, right? Even though that's not at all what we're saying. We're just saying race didn't make it hard, right?
It's a little bit of both, right? So, you know, the straight A crowd who, you know, I teach at the University of Georgia, they've gotten where they've gotten to by doing exactly what their teachers told them to do when their teachers told them to do it, because their teachers told them to do it. And, you know, their teachers weren't always the wisest people, right? So the idea that they've been distorted by people they were taught to like obey without question is a hard pill. Or that their teachers, and this is another thing, that their parents or their teachers might set them up for dreams, and if they actually achieve those dreams, will be miserable. So like as it stands, they are set up with an idea of success that if that idea of success is realized, is going to lead to like drug habit, awful kids themselves, a spouse they don't like, because they actually got what they aspired for. The problem is they've been groomed to have like kind of distorted aspirations. They can't be justified by reason alone, right? So the idea that they might have aspirations that have been fed to them, that they got their dignity and identity from, that themselves will lead to a miserable life, is kind of
hard to swallow.
It's hard to swallow. But a lot of them are a little bit miserable and depressed and anxious themselves. So like what I'm doing is also clarifying the source of their anxiety. They think they might be set up for like a very shallow form of success that will leave them undernourished and living a meaningless life. And I'm just saying that it might be the case that you've been fed a very shallow notion of success that might be setting you up for a, depending on who you talk to, meaningless life that will be good for the GDP of Georgia or the institutional needs of Procter and Gamble. When I talk to students about this, I'm saying that like, look, if you're an Apple and you're in charge, if you're Tim Cook or whatever, and you have a choice, you could either design a better phone, or you could turn the iPhone users into blue bubble bigots who won't message or text message with anyone with a green bubble because the green bubble is ugly and it's kind of stigmatized. So are you going to design a better phone and put like the zillions of dollars it would take to design a better phone? Or you're going to run like a $2 million ad campaign and market to like low-key turn Apple users into people who will not only not ever switch to Android themselves because they don't want to deal with the green bubble, but will kind of exclude.
Like hate on their own friends because they don't have. I have had friends be like, turn on iMessage, dude, it bothers me. Like what you're talking about, I've literally experienced that. Like,
blue bubble bigotry is real, right? And like you'll screw up, like the green bubble people will screw up an entire group chat, right? Group chat bubble green, and screw that up in a way that makes people uncomfortable. So like they get left out of things, right? So,
for something that's totally like, it's not, there's no tangible difference between these two people or the quality of the phone or the message itself or anything at all. It's just a pure interpretation that's been kind of instilled upon them, right?
So like there's this idea that you have these external pressures that actually work on you and groom you to making decisions in your life that might not be working for you and might actually turn you into a bigot, whether it's a blue bubble bigot or an anti-black bigot. Like it does, like
homophobe, misogynist,
right. But it's all for the interest of this thing, this external entity that needs your blue bubble bigotry in order to survive. In the same way that anti-communism needed a Brown versus Board of Education verdict, and like the Southern economic renaissance needed the Brown versus the Board of Education in order for it to be a functional part of. So you can't tell a story about Apple's success, and this is actually good. They can tie it up. You can't tell a story about Apple's success in cornering the market without telling a story about blue bubble bigotry.
And that's basically right there. If you're trying to do that without that context, that is a fantastic metaphor. So the last thing I wanted to hit on here is, do you think this is a really like intentional, explicit campaign from the conservatives to try to oppose critical race theory? Because my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you have a lot more experience in post-grad work and stuff like that. But my understanding is if your kid is learning critical race theory, your kid is probably in graduate school or law school, or like, it's not like we're teaching these to sophomores in high school, right? So so the sort of the blow up about this and the extreme response, do you think that's intentional and coordinated, or do you think that's a more discrete social like kind of pressure at play?
I think it's intentional and coordinated because it's a scary name. What I think is awesome is that critical race theory is awesome. So this is like they picked critical race theory as like the boogeyman because of a scary name. It's not anti-white, it's anti-formal. It's just that formal instructions kind of tend to be pro-white, kind of like Anatole France's quote where like, the laws and its majestic equality like ban poor people and rich people from begging and sleeping under bridges and all these things. Although rich people are allowed to beg in different ways, but they call it pitching, but like the laws and its majestic equality and its formal equality doesn't make a distinction between rich people and poor people when it says that nobody can sleep under a bridge. But that's a quality of formal equality that actually calcifies injustice, because it makes the people who need to sleep under bridges now have to deal with a landlord who like now has more power over them because like one of the options is taken over. So like there's a way in which formal equality actually calcifies political injustice that doesn't get talked about except in critical race theory. So we get to have these conversations now because like critical race theory is explicitly a realist intervention against formalist methods, because formalist methods don't actually explain what's going on and what the thing is. And
so you think
now
it's recognized as a threat to the system itself? Like you think that the conservatives are recognizing that our institutional power, whereby we can kind of under the radar implement these oppressive pressures, that's being threatened.
The veneer of formalism, the veneer that they don't make distinctions. Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I don't think it was picked because it's threatening, but I do think it actually is. Like I think they're making a bad move with this, and I'm happy that the conservatives kind of slipped, because usually they're pretty good about these things. But you have to understand that one of the issues with the civil rights movement was the struggle with the civil rights movement, and Gandhi talks about this when he's talking about India, and King talks about this, is you got to get white people to embarrass themselves. You got to get white people to expose their awfulness. And that's actually hard because we have all of these ideological barriers and institutions to kind of shield the awfulness and the degradation and the violence of how white supremacy is sustained. So the trick is you have to get the oppressed people doing something normal and regular and responsible, and then like get like the backlash, the violent, huge backlash, like that's overwrought, and get it in the media, right? And then have white people reflect on how awful they are to themselves, right? So that was like that's the struggle with nonviolent protest. The great news is these town hall meetings where white people are being awful, great, is fantastic. They're not going to age well. Their kids are going to be embarrassed by them. It's really it's wonderful art for the movement, because it gets white people to tell on themselves about their commitments in a way that like normally they would deny having. Right. So like now you get these, like I actually think the town hall meetings and the cell phones in the town hall meetings, those videos are going to do more for the project of racial justice than the cop lapel cams and dashboard cams. Because now we get to tell the truth. Like we get white people writing out loud in ways that they might not be media trained to do. And it's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, because any individual case, right, the cop can always say, no, it wasn't because he was black, right? Any individual case, they can always try to make some sort of, but when we're actually talking about these issues on a macro level, and the white community is still coming out and saying this kind of horrendous bullshit, you know what I mean? That is very revealing.
Right. It's telling out that they don't know what critical, like they're just exposing all the ignorance and the violence and like their stakes in like keeping the hotel as it is. Ways that are like kind of unbecoming, and would normally be denied if it's said that like actually you have these psychic investments in white supremacy that you're not like really open to admitting. But now
or acknowledging,
now they're acknowledging it, so that's pretty cool. So I'm glad for this fight. I'm glad it moved to a terrain where we could actually kind of discuss philosophy in an interesting way and like historical events in a more interesting way. And we have to understand that, like with the Brown versus Board of Education, it goes two ways. You don't understand Brown versus Board of Education without understanding anti-communism, Black veterans, and economic aspirations for the American South. You also don't understand anti-communism without the America's understanding of anti-communism without the civil rights movement. You don't understand as part of a strategy for the economic revitalization of the South, the civil rights movement. Like you don't understand like how we keep veterans happy without also referencing the civil rights movement. So it works both ways. They're imbricated with each other. So you can't talk about either without referencing the other. And anyone who tries to talk about one without referencing the other is giving you an abstract and kind of distorted understanding of reality and truth.
Yeah. Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to ask you about here is you've talked about, and this is kind of tying back to an earlier question, but I think it's actually very important to teach kids this, not just grad students, but kids. And you've talked about sending white kids home with difficult questions and how that actually can impact parents, right? Like when your kid is coming to you and challenging you on a societal view that you hold, that actually really can hit a lot of people in a way that they might actually reevaluate their view. Can you talk about how important that is?
Well, I mean, this is why they killed Socrates, right? He was corrupting the youth, right? And pretty much what corrupting the youth, Socrates is a philosopher, depending on who you talk to, he kind of the father of the discipline. And he ended up being executed for corrupting the youth. And depending on who you talk to, corrupting youth is like just making parenting uncomfortable for corrupt parents. Right? Yeah. So like people who are more concerned with their wealth, their comfort than they are with the truth are going to be made, they're going to feel somewhat oppressed by the truth if it's not comfortable, right? So the idea that you're arming kids in a way to have hard conversations, or they're not necessarily hard conversations, uncomfortable conversations with their parents, and how that's somehow irresponsible is tough, right? So we have to understand that the racial hierarchy in America is held together by variegated institutions. What do I mean by this? I mean, there isn't like some bureau of white supremacy. No, it's actually like it's infused in all of these mutually reinforcing but differentiated institutions. For example, the white church, the white family, the white business culture, the white conservative politics, all of them are different, but they all mutually reinforce each other as in like with an organic logic. That's like kind of like they're all kind of bodies of the same thing. But and so they all mutually reinforce each other. So if you just try to take out one without taking out the others, it's like a Horcrux. Yeah. If you read Harry Potter, you got the justice as a Horcrux problem, freedom as a Horcrux problem. Like you got to take them all out, right? So the white family, as it stands, with the stories they tell themselves about themselves, like reinforces the white church, which reinforces the white school, and it'll reinforce, all of these other white institutions that end up like sustaining the racial hierarchy. So what this does, when you change the school, you actually destabilize the white family. So the people, like in a well-ordered world, the white family isn't gonna look the same. I mean, even if it'll still be made up of white people, but like they're not going to interact with each other in the same way.
In the same ways, yeah.
The way they interact with each other as it stands isn't particularly great.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. Like it's not as if suburbs are like happy, meaningful places for a lot of people. I've seen the medicine cabinets. So like the ennui is real, and like the kids being like kind of like, I think I'm living a shallow, meaningless life. Like that's real. So in a well-ordered world, after the revolution, like the white family isn't going to like relate to each other in the same way. And that's going to be good. I think people are be happier and have more meaningful like conversations with each other, and the gender relationships will be better. And I actually think sex will be better. And like, there's a lot of spousal weight in that we don't talk about, but like that's a whole different conversation. So like the people who think that racial justice and actually teaching history in school will affect their family life, they're actually right. And that's appropriate. But it's okay. Your family life could be improved by being by like more truth in the world.
Yeah, and just a quick note to the white parents out there: if your kids ask you a question that's tough to you, look in the mirror. Like learn from that, grow from that. That's it. You know what I mean? We all should view that as a positive. The generation that we've created is having an understanding that is challenging our worldview. That's something we should actually aspire to and celebrate, instead of kind of going into this protective mode.
Right. So like if you grew up thinking, well, the 14th Amendment says equal protection of the law, so Brown versus Board of Education is about the 14th Amendment, and your kid says like, yeah, but there's also free association and like forced desegregation, like like is forcing me to associate with people that I might not want to deal with. So how did the court make the decision? And so were there any external factors? If your kid says that to you, that's like an opportunity to say like, huh, that's actually right. So like the court could have came down in any way and it both would have been legal. Why did it come down on this way, not that way? Why did it break tradition? It can't just
when, by the way, if that case had been 50 years earlier, I think we all know what the finding would have been, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, we already had it.
Yeah.
So like this is actually opportunity to learn and grow, and I think it would actually like bring people closer.
Yeah, absolutely. So just if you want to reiterate where people can find your work, Irami.
Yes. So you can go to www.funkyacademic.com and like my videos are there. Or if I think the most recent one is going to be on my YouTube channel. So just put in Funky Academic or my name, Irami, in YouTube, and you'll find me there. And I'll talk about this. I'm going on Crystal Ball and Saga and Jetty's show.
Hey, Breaking Points, huh?
Breaking Points. I'm going on Breaking Points on Monday. So that's going to be fun. I'm going to talk about infrastructure, and it's going to be, I think a pretty good conversation. So I'll be on Breaking Points on Monday, and I like what Crystal and Saga does. I don't know if your audience knows Crystal, but she kind of gave me a platform for no good reason. And I'm very grateful for that. Like, just because like she liked the quality of how I think in my mind and all that stuff. And she's like, and she took a lot of heat from it, from her producers. So when Crystal Ball was on Rising, like she had me come on and like I'd say what I'd say, and then like she'd get like all of the emails coming back, the backlash, and yet she would have me on again and kind of provide cover for me. So like she's a class lady, and so I support her and all the work they're doing. And I'm going on Breaking Points, their new internet show on Monday, and talk about.
We'll definitely be looking for that. Well, he and she, I bet you'll get a kick out of this if you didn't see it already, but Crystal and Sagar did an interview with Kyle Kulinski and Marshall Kozlov talking about their leaving the Hill and what had actually happened. And they actually mentioned you. They said, when we would have certain guests on, like the Funky Academic, we'd have to sit there and wonder what the executives were going to think about what he said, So I think it'll be great that you can go on their independent show. I think it's terrible how the Hill treated them, quite frankly. And I think Crystal and Sagar do a pretty fantastic show. So that's how I found you. I'm very grateful for that. So, I'll be looking forward to that episode and hope that we can do this again sometime.
Yeah. And by the way, if you like what I do at my show, I put a lot of thought and time into this. So go ahead and kick $5, $15, or $50, become a member at thefunkyacademic.com or funkyacademic.com. It'll help me kind of, come up with a marketing budget, maybe get more help and get out there more.
Absolutely encourage people to do that. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again, Irami. Look forward to doing this again. Alrighty, so I thought that was a really fantastic segment from Irami, who never ceases to impress. He's always forcing me and I hope everybody else to kind of expand the way that they're thinking about things. I often think that I am looking at something from 10,000 feet, and then Irami comes along and is like, "Let's go up a few more thousand. You're not getting the big picture." So he does absolutely fantastic work. I encourage you all to follow the Funky Academic, always speaking on important issues and bringing new perspectives to those important issues. I wanted to close the show out today by tying something that really the topic of the discussion with Vinay. And big thanks to him again for coming on the show. He's a friend of the show and a regular guest. But he talked about kind of living our values. And while I know you guys didn't know her, I want to just once again talk about my grandma for a second. She was very determined to help those who have been left behind. And that was how she lived her life. And I want to encourage all of my audience members to embrace that. And the things that Vinay was talking about, that we can build community through our actions and through how we view our own role in the universe and in our society. I just want to encourage everybody to be determined and have the courage of their convictions to continue fighting for those who have been left behind by our society and continue fighting for marginalized and impoverished communities. So thank you all very much for tuning in to what turned out to be a very long episode. And I just, seriously, you guys, from the bottom of my heart, I can't thank you guys enough. This was a very difficult show for me in many ways, but it also, I love being here and being part of a fantastic progressive community, and you all mean the absolute world to me. So thank you for tuning in, and I hope to see everybody back here next week.